In 1989, the industrial growth in the American state of Indiana allowed certain businesses to reach unprecedented heights, with businessmen reaping the benefits. John Parker was one of them. John started working at a very young age. As a teenager, he took a job at a restaurant clearing dishes from tables. However, this was not enough for the ambitious young man, and he ventured into selling vacuum cleaners. Going door-to-door selling vacuum cleaners doesn't usually earn much. Even his own family mocked John's choice. The laughter stopped when, just a few months later, the 19-year-old broke all sales records. It seemed like he went from nothing to a super successful person overnight, but that wasn't the case. John worked tirelessly for his goals, putting in 12 to 16 hours a day. Despite his hard work, he wasn't selfish and willingly shared his knowledge and experience to inspire colleagues to excel in their work. Confident and very charismatic, the young man moved to Michigan, where he opened his own vacuum cleaner sales center. The wave of success brought 20-year-old Judy Hicks to his shore. Judy was self-assured and assertive, but she had to be. Unlike John, who grew up in a middle-class family, Judy knew poverty. She married very young and became a mother of 2 children, Christina and Danny. However, her married life didn't work out, and after the divorce, to make ends meet and take care of her children, she also decided to start selling vacuum cleaners. John helped her, first as a colleague, then as a lover. The closer they became, the more successful the business developed. Judy became his right-hand woman. Every time he gave a speech, John started by saying he wouldn't have achieved anything without Judy. The couple married at the end of 1992 and opened a training center for other sales professionals, J&J Parker Industries. By the age of 30, John became a millionaire, and his family grew with 2 more daughters, Tiffany and Erica. Christina and Danny also called John their dad, spent a lot of time at the office with their parents, and it was impossible to tell that John wasn't the biological father of the older children. The family led a deliberately luxurious lifestyle. This was one of John's philosophies, to radiate success so that his employees would also strive for success. He was an idol of the youth of that generation. However, after 10 years of marriage, many things changed. John, once a cheerful and content man, turned into a bundle of nerves. However, not without reason. His wife cheated on him with their colleague. John became suspicious and installed several surveillance cameras at work, which confirmed his wife's affair. It was a severe blow to his ego. He started drinking. Judy begged him to hand over the incriminating video, but John refused. It would give him a significant advantage in divorce proceedings. However, he had no intention of divorcing. As he jokingly told a friend, it's cheaper to keep her, so John decided to take his wife as far away from her lover as possible. The family returned to Indiana and settled in the prestigious neighborhood of Crown Point. John opened an office in Merrillville, Indiana, and disbanded the office staff in Michigan. He brought with him only his most loyal employees, including his trusted confidant, Ben. John brought Ben from Michigan and began training him in everything so that when he decided to step back from business, it would continue to thrive. Together, they built a business empire and seemed to be living better than they could have ever imagined. However, on Thursday, April 17, 2003, the emergency services received 2 calls reporting an armed attack in the warehouse district where John Parker's company office was located. The calls came from John's wife, Judy Parker, and his manager, Ben. When the police arrived, they first searched the entire area, including dumpsters and rooftops, in case the suspect was hiding somewhere. Finding no one, they returned to the crime scene and to John Parker, as he turned out to be the victim. His car was parked in front of the office, and he was found lying on the ground with a single bullet hole in the back of his head. The gunshot wound was fatal. A casing from a .25 caliber semi-automatic pistol was found nearby the body. What surprised investigators was that a second identical casing was found some distance away from the victim. The man's wallet was missing from his pocket, and at first glance, it appeared to be a botched robbery. While the medical examiner took the body for autopsy, investigators had to find out from Ben and Judy what they had seen. In Judy's account, she behaved unusually calmly, which the detectives attributed to shock. She explained that in the evening, she and her husband had dinner at a local restaurant while their 4 children stayed home watching a movie. One of their younger daughters, Tiffany, had been misbehaving at school, and the couple wanted to discuss discipline for her. The next day was the start of spring break, so it was clear the girl would be spending all her days at home. At some point, their daughter Christina called and said that Tiffany had left her homework in the office, so the couple stopped by to pick it up. While John exchanged a few words with Ben, Judy retrieved their daughter's work and went back to the car. The couple intended to pass some leftover food from the restaurant to Ben. John walked over to the car and opened the rear passenger door behind the driver's seat. Judy saw her husband open the car door, and almost immediately, 2 loud bangs rang out. She ducked down, and when she looked up, she saw John fall, and a person dressed all in black quickly running away from the car. It was dark, and she couldn't make out who it was. This story puzzled the detectives. Typically, a robber rarely shoots the victim immediately. Usually, there's a short conversation that escalates before it comes to gunfire, but not this time. They suspected it wasn't a botched robbery. Furthermore, besides the wallet, John was wearing a Rolex watch and other valuable men's jewelry. Judy mentioned that her husband, as a businessman, often had conflicts with other people. He was very demanding of himself and his colleagues. About 3 weeks before the murder, he had a heated argument with a former employee right in the office parking lot. The men exchanged harsh words, and police intervention was required to separate them. Company manager Ben confirmed that such an argument took place. John accused the former employee of not returning all the equipment after his departure. The employee, in turn, believed that he hadn't received all the owed payment. However, everything was resolved. The employee returned the equipment and received the appropriate payment. This turned out to be a dead-end lead that didn't lead anywhere. John was killed on a Thursday evening. However, the previous Monday, a school officer from Crown Point contacted the Merrillville police. He learned about the murder from the news and wanted to share important information. For about 6 months, he had known about a conspiracy to murder John Parker involving 3 teenagers. 2 of them were caught with a large sum of cash. The school became suspicious of how 15-year-old students had such a large sum of money, so they questioned them. Although they were interviewed separately, their stories completely matched. They told of their classmate Danny, John Parker's stepson, paying them to kill his stepfather. The seized money was only part of the sum. In reality, they received several $1,000s. However, they deceived Danny, having no intention of even coming close to his stepfather. Since the boys had no intention of committing murder, the school simply confiscated the money and did not pursue the matter further. They didn't even contact Danny's parents or interview him about the incident. Yet, this was an opportunity to learn more about the issues clearly evident in the family. Now, 6 months later, John was dead, murdered, and the police had to determine whether his stepson could be involved. Investigators began interviewing family members, friends, and neighbors of John. The overall impression was that he was an excellent boss and friend, well-liked despite being quite strict and having a volatile temper. John worked very hard but spent every evening with his family. However, it became increasingly difficult for him to keep track of his teenage children, 17-year-old Christina and 15-year-old Danny. Little Christina was simply a wonderful child, but when her mother married John and she was plunged into a world of newfound financial possibilities, all the girl wanted to do was party, enjoy life, and throw parties in their new big house. Soon, she started getting into trouble. Her younger brother Danny wasn't far behind. He was generally more spirited and restless than his sister, and his antics were accordingly mischievous. One evening, without permission and without a driver's license, he took his father's SUV and knocked over mailboxes of neighbors. After that, John had to go around to all of them and negotiate so they wouldn't report his stepson's actions to the police. It's worth noting that John himself grew up in a family with very strict rules and tried to impose similar rules on his family so that the older children wouldn't get into trouble with the law. Of course, the teenagers didn't like this and rebelled. And what about Judy? She preferred to be a friend rather than a mother to Christina and Danny. The parents seemed to be clearly divided into good and bad cops. What was most horrifying was that the younger girls saw the atmosphere in the house unfold and also didn't listen. After learning about the family situation, investigators hurried even more to find the 2 classmates of Danny and interview him himself. Danny did not deny conflicts with his stepfather, who tried to raise him as best he could. He admitted to giving money to his classmates, but not to kill John, just to scare and beat him up. And he had the money simply because he had been saving it for some time. Danny was still detained, and detectives had to find out if 2 teenagers accidentally killed John while trying to scare him. It turned out that one of the boys was in prison on the day of the murder, and the other lived in Las Vegas with his grandmother. Detectives went to Vegas and spoke with the teenager. He insisted that Danny had tried to persuade someone to actually kill his stepfather. But he and his friend tricked Danny and took the money without intending to commit murder. Police confirmed that the boy was in Vegas on April 17th, so this turned out to be another dead end. Danny was released home. Meanwhile, John's farewell took place. The man himself liked to repeat that people would forget your name, forget what you said, but they would not forget the feelings you evoked in them. At his funeral, everyone remembered what a wonderful person he was and how positively he influenced those around him. But someone directly stated that the worst part wasn't that John lay in a coffin, but that the person responsible for his death was probably in the same building with them. It was an unpleasant, oppressive feeling shared by everyone. But a week later, the image of the perfect family took another hit when a colleague of John's revealed a new lead, this time involving his stepdaughter, 17-year-old Christina. An employee of J&J Parker Industries disclosed that Christina, who also worked in her parents' company, approached him to find a hitman to kill her stepfather. For her troubles, she gave him $100 and handed over an additional $500 as a down payment for the hitman. Incredibly, this was another plot to kill John, which ended with Christina being deceived once again. However, suspicion now fell not only on Danny, but also on Christina. The girl denied everything, claiming she simply complained to her colleague about her stepfather, and he misunderstood her. Without details from Christina regarding the money exchange, investigators again hit a dead end. Was this a coincidence? Or had the teenagers conspired and were hiding a much darker plan? Several weeks later, a month after John Parker's murder, the police stumbled upon another lead leading to Christina's classmates. Under pressure, they confessed to selling a weapon to Christina that was used for shooting practice on a family farm. Officers found a tree with bullet marks on the farm, and on the ground, they discovered casings. Ballistics analysis confirmed that the casings matched those found at the crime scene. Now the police could link Christina to the purchase of the weapon, but the girl simply denied everything. And since the police didn't have the murder weapon in hand, and Christina had an alibi, she was watching a movie at home with her younger sisters, they couldn't prove that she killed John. So who pulled the trigger? The circle narrowed around family members, but for the prosecutor it wasn't enough. There was only a conspiracy, but no weapon, and no person to pin it on. Meanwhile, without John, his family and business gradually fell apart. Judy spent all her time with her new boyfriend Ben, John's right-hand man. The children were forced to take care of themselves, cooking and cleaning the house. This spoke volumes because after a tragedy, a parent instinctively seeks to spend more time with their children. Judy did just the opposite, indicating she wasn't truly attached to her husband or children. The business also declined, and Judy and the children struggled financially. Judy was supposed to receive $1 million from 2 of John's insurance policies, but because the investigation was ongoing, the insurance company refused to pay her. Judy and Ben moved with the younger girls to Michigan. Danny and his biological father went to Arizona, where the boy found work on a construction site. Christina, expecting her first child, stayed in Indiana with her boyfriend Eric. Only John's close friends and family continued to push for the investigation to continue, which it did without ceasing. In 2007, 4 years after John's murder, a detective from the narcotics department contacted one of the investigators on the case. He informed them that Christina's husband, Eric Grabski, was involved in a drug-related investigation, and there was already a warrant out for his arrest. Detectives seized the opportunity to glean new information about the old case. They speculated that the hope of a deal with the prosecution would loosen Eric's tongue, and they were not wrong. Eric knew who killed John. The triggerman turned out to be Christina's younger brother, Danny. The question was whether Christina would confirm her husband's words. Eric called her and she agreed to come to the station. She stated that her stepbrother Danny had killed her stepfather. However, initially she tried to downplay her role, minimizing her involvement in the case. But investigators had already determined that she purchased the weapon, and it was she who called her parents about her sister's homework, even though school holidays, including Easter, were starting the next day, so there was no rush to collect Tiffany's homework. Therefore, detectives knew that Christina played an active role in the murder. They pressured her, and she confessed that she knew about all the conspiracies to kill John. She, her brother, and her mother had spent over a year trying to find someone willing to kill John, spending several $1,000s on their search. But after multiple unsuccessful attempts with incompetent contractors, they decided that Danny would do it. Detectives flew to Arizona, where Danny lived and worked. When an investigator approached him and mentioned being from Merrillville, Danny visibly softened. The detective asked, "Do you know why I'm here?" To which Danny replied, "I'm ready to tell everything." It was clear that this weighed heavily on him, and he regretted what had happened. Here's what he revealed. The murder of John was Judy's plan. She constantly told the children that she couldn't live with John anymore, that he mistreated her and was abusive. However, when Danny was asked if he ever witnessed such behavior towards his mother, he couldn't recall anything of the sort. Moreover, the police never responded to the family's address. Also, the mother promised the older children that life would be much better without John. They would have money and no control from a strict stepfather who demanded that the children study well and behave properly. Initially, Judy attempted to poison her husband personally, but she failed. Then she and the children began looking for someone willing to carry out this job for money. However, finding a killer and buying a weapon required money. To secretly obtain such large sums from her husband, Judy forged company checks. She stole $7,500 and John was about to find out about it. Ultimately, Judy decided they would do everything themselves. She devised a plan in which all three would have alibis. The mother decided her 15-year-old son, Danny, would commit the murder. Christina's role was to call and lure John to the office. Christina gave Danny the keys to her car, even though he didn't even have a driver's license yet. The accomplices took a huge risk, and at any moment, things could have gone awry. Nevertheless, the teenager climbed out of his bedroom window to avoid being noticed by his younger sisters, got in the car, drove to the office, and waited. He saw the parents arrive, hid behind a dumpster, and waited for an opportunity to shoot. When John approached the car and opened the door, Danny ran up and fired. The gun accidentally fired a second time when he tried to reach for the man's wallet, hence the second shell casing being far from the body. This clarified one of the mysteries that had been troubling the investigators. Danny then fled, got into the car, and quickly returned home, where Christina awaited with a bag into which he placed his clothes, the weapon, and the wallet. He took a shower, and they didn't discuss it further. Christina later handed the bag to her mother, and Judy disposed of it. Following Christina and Danny's confessions, both were arrested. Now the police had to arrest the puppeteer behind her husband's murder, Judy Parker, but the police had absolutely nothing against her. Fortunately, her children agreed to testify against their mother in exchange for reduced sentences. Then Judy decided to confess her guilt in 2009. Christina was sentenced to 5 years in prison for her role in the crime. However, after her release in 2013, she died of a drug overdose at the age of 27. Danny was sentenced to 23 years. He was released 3 years after his sister in 2016. Judy was sentenced to 33 years in prison. She was released in 2023. Judy spent her entire life as a sales agent, and she certainly found a way to sell the idea of murder to her own children. Most likely, she manipulated them for years, and only when they were distanced from her could they clearly see the whole picture. Of course, Judy could have divorced, but she would have received only half of the property and wouldn't have received the $1 million from the insurance. Additionally, John had evidence of marital infidelity. He gave his wife a ticket to a luxurious life, but she no longer wanted to see her husband nearby, yet she wanted to have it all, and anyone standing in her way between the life she had and the life she wanted had to disappear. She forced her teenage children to commit murder, robbing them of their childhood and burdening them with a heavy load. And she shattered the lives of her younger daughters, who now have no father, no older sister, and essentially no mother. On April 18, 2011, Jessica Bullock couldn't sit still all day. It had been a whole day since she had been able to reach her mother, 46-year-old Rebecca or Becky Porter, whereas they usually talked every day. Jessica was particularly concerned because her mother had been complaining of feeling unwell, possibly food poisoning or something similar. Jessica urged her mother to go to the hospital, but Becky, who disliked missing work, kept putting it off. On April 17th, the last time they spoke, Becky promised her daughter she would check on herself in the morning. Yet, evening had come the next day, and there was still no word from her mother. Jessica checked with other family members, but they couldn't reach Becky either. Jessica deserves credit. She could have assumed that with Becky's husband, Russell, or Rusty, as his relatives lived nearby, there was no cause for concern. But no, she decided to check in person. Jessica got into her car and drove 45 minutes to her mother's house. She hadn't been there many times, but she immediately sensed that something was wrong. One of the doors was wide open. Lights were on inside the house, and her mother's car was parked in the driveway. Jessica approached the door and called out for her mother, but all she got in response was chilling silence. It was a scene straight out of a horror movie. the only illuminated house in the middle of a large plot of land, seemingly occupied but unresponsive to calls. Fearing what she might find inside, around midnight, Jessica contacted the Greene County, Missouri Rescue Service. The responding police officers thoroughly searched all the rooms and informed Jessica that there were no intruders inside. However, they couldn't calm her down because there was nobody in the house at all. Instead, they encountered a plethora of details that alarmed even the experienced officers. Disorder reigned in the bedroom. Items were strewn across the floor, including bedding, and the mattress was askew, as if someone had abruptly jumped out of bed. Becky's phone and purse containing credit cards, cash, and documents were left behind. Rusty's medications lay on the bedside table. He took them daily after his cancerous tumor removal, and he would have taken them with him if they had left. However, how could the couple have left the house if their only car, which they shared, was parked at home with the keys in the ignition? In another room, likely a home office, a tangle of cables lay on the floor. But the most alarming discoveries awaited the officers in the kitchen. First and foremost, they were almost overwhelmed by the strong smell of bleach. Puddles of bleach were gleaming on the floor, yet the only bleach bottle under the sink was completely full. The kitchen window was open, and the protective screen on it was torn. Finally, after circling around the house, the officers discovered scattered broken surveillance cameras. It seemed like initially they were positioned to cover maximum area around the house, but someone had walked around the house and destroyed them all. Some cables connected to these cameras ran through the walls of the house, leading to the same home office where the tangle of wires lay. When the officers returned to the room, they realized that the cameras and monitor on the floor were connected to a computer, which was conspicuously absent. This was one of the most telling pieces of evidence, especially considering that Rusty had installed the cameras quite recently. Moreover, it's not common for people to install so many cameras in the middle of a farm. Was Rusty afraid of something? All the findings suggested that the spouses weren't together at the time of their sudden disappearance. The first theory of the detectives was that perhaps Becky and Rusty became victims of a botched nighttime robbery. However, the evidence didn't support this theory. Besides the car and cash, other valuable items like the television remained untouched. Maybe Rusty got into trouble, owed money to someone, and the couple decided to disappear this way. Did one spouse do something to the other, get scared of the crime committed, and flee? Or did someone attack them in the middle of the night? At that moment, investigators were considering numerous scenarios, each worse than the other, and doubted a favorable outcome. The police began questioning friends and relatives of the couple, starting with Rusty's mother, Kay Simmons, who lived in a small house directly behind the family home. She recounted that Rusty and Becky had only been married for about a year. The newlyweds moved into the house on the 49-acre property owned by Kay's parents. Also, less than a kilometer away from the young couple, Kay's brother and Rusty's uncle, Robert Campbell, lived with his wife Carolyn. Rusty and Becky seemed like a very happy couple, but their relationship raised doubts among their close circle. Some were uneasy about the 12-year age gap between the spouses, and Jessica and her brother even skipped their mother's wedding. On the evening of the previous day, the 17th, Rusty's son dropped by to ask his mother for painkillers because Becky wasn't feeling well. According to Kay, Rusty behaved as usual and didn't tell his mother anything that would worry her. She also didn't hear any strange sounds later that night. But when she stepped onto the porch the next morning, she saw Becky's car. Kay was surprised because Becky was a very responsible, hard-working woman who never left for work later than 7:30. Despite her son and daughter-in-law living just a few steps away from her house, she tried not to intrude and didn't go to them, simply assuming that Becky stayed home because she was unwell. But now she was certain that something had happened to her son and daughter-in-law before the morning of the 18th. Meanwhile, detectives questioned her about Rusty and Becky's relationship. Did they have any problems? Could anyone have harbored a grudge against them? And Kay immediately thought of one person. Before marrying Rusty, Becky spent 26 years in a marriage with a church pastor. However, they decided to divorce, and according to their friends, they couldn't part amicably. The former spouses fought for a long time over ownership rights of the restaurant they had previously managed together. They had been divorced for only 4 months when Becky met her future husband online. Naturally, this piqued the interest of investigators, and on the 4th day of the investigation, they questioned the ex-husband. However, it quickly became apparent that he had no connection to Becky and Rusty's disappearance. Although their divorce was accompanied by scandals, the man continued to live his life, and he had a solid alibi for the time of the couple's disappearance. Moreover, he seemed genuinely upset about what could have happened to them. After ruling out Becky's ex-husband, the police continued to delve into the personal lives of the newlyweds. Once again, the investigators quickly uncovered something interesting. Becky had complained that she couldn't stand it anymore and things couldn't continue like this. When the police questioned her daughter Jessica about this, she said that her mother had confided in her that she and her husband had been arguing frequently lately. Of course, various negative scenarios immediately sprang to the detectives' minds, suggesting that Rusty might have done something to Becky and then fled. However, unlike Becky's family, all of Rusty's relatives and friends unanimously insisted that he sincerely loved his wife, and they had never seen him happier. He truly loved her and had changed for the better because of her. So why did the woman complain to her daughter about problems? It turned out that Becky had grievances, not against her husband, but against his family, specifically against one person. Becky's grievances were directed towards Rusty's uncle, Robert Campbell. Robert lived nearby Rusty and Becky on the same 49-acre property. Kay and her brother Robert had always been very close, but he didn't like the fact that his nephew had settled on the property, which he likely considered entirely his own. He was very possessive about anything that belonged to his parents, down to the smallest details. The rift between uncle and nephew had escalated to the point where both had tried to obtain restraining orders against each other multiple times. The last time Rusty filed a complaint against his uncle was 1 or 2 weeks before the disappearance. In his statement, Rusty described how Robert, passing by the couple's house, shouted that Rusty should be careful because he wouldn't stay there for long. When investigators spoke to Robert, he didn't deny the obvious and admitted that his relationship with his nephew was strained, but he claimed that the threats were just words without meaning. Moreover, he had more reason to fear Rusty, as he was just an old man with health problems, and of course, he would never harm his nephew or his wife. Additionally, Robert had a very solid alibi. He worked as a long-haul truck driver, and during the couple's disappearance, he was headed to Texas with his wife. This was confirmed by phone records for both Robert and his wife, Carolyn. With Becky's ex-husband and Rusty's uncle ruled out as suspects, investigators hit a dead end. However, another crime shook them out of it. On April 25th, a week after the couple's disappearance, police were called to the scene of a double homicide of another married couple. The second crime eerily resembled the disappearance of the Porter couple, and it also began with a call to 911. Early in the morning around 5 o'clock, a neighbor of the couple called emergency services and said he had scared off a stranger wearing a black hoodie. The person ran away down the road. When officers arrived, they found Donald and Helen Willingham murdered. They had been attacked with a knife. The similarities were striking. An unknown assailant had broken into both couples' homes. Almost nothing was stolen, and there were no obvious suspects. Furthermore, Donald was a pastor, and Becky had been married to a pastor for over 20 years. Investigators pondered whether the cases were connected, or if it was just an astonishing coincidence. Was there a serial killer roaming the county, targeting married couples? However, a breakthrough occurred in the Donald and Helen Willingham case 3 months later. A young man named Jose Huckleberry was arrested on charges of robbery. After 7 hours of interrogation, he confessed to the murders. When detectives learned his motive and the details of the attacks, they had to admit that these two cases were not linked. The situation for the investigation was not improving. All the evidence collected up to that point suggested that Rusty and Becky's disappearance was linked to some crime. But what? Now the investigators had neither a motive nor any suspects. The couple's relatives and friends did everything possible to keep the public aware of the case. They printed a huge number of flyers and posted them in all frequented places, gave interviews to local media, and of course, continued to cling to the only glimmer of hope in the realm of dark thoughts and forebodings: hope. Despite the grim circumstances, the community remained supportive, rallying around the missing couple's loved ones and assisting in any way they could. The search for Rusty and Becky continued, fueled by determination and the unwavering belief that answers would eventually surface. And suddenly, completely unexpectedly, a new lead emerged. A prisoner serving time in the local jail came forward with information that would interest investigators. Shortly before his arrest, he was relaxing in a bar where he met a man named Tony Friend. They struck up a conversation during which Tony boasted about several crimes he had committed. Among them was the murder of Rusty and Becky Porter. Detectives were skeptical of the informant, who naturally came forward only in hopes of striking a deal with the prosecutor. However, they were obligated to investigate. At the very least, they needed to find out who this Tony Friend was. The more they delved into the man's past, the fewer doubts remained about the informant's words. Tony Friend, 43, had a history of repeated involvement in violent attacks and armed robberies, rather than minor offenses, indicating a propensity for cruelty. However, it was only after examining his phone data that detectives believed they had a solid lead. On the night of April 17th, he was in close proximity to Rusty and Becky Porter's home, and then he headed towards the Cedar Creek area, known for its vast expanse of dense forest. Although investigators didn't know exactly where, they invited him in for questioning, but it proved to be a futile exercise. Tony denied any connection to the couple, claiming he hadn't committed any crimes and had no knowledge of the matter. He didn't answer most of the questions, and those he did answer were so evasive that essentially the only thing he confirmed was his name and age. Detectives had hoped for a more fruitful outcome, but they were now convinced that they needed to dig deeper in this direction. Knowing that Tony had been near the missing couple's home before heading towards Cedar Creek, investigators decided to speak with his relatives and friends. Since Tony grew up in the area, he likely knew it well, and there could have been a secluded spot known only to his close acquaintances. They were right. Tony's cousin immediately recalled a place where they used to play as children. It was an area with dense vegetation near Cedar Creek, inaccessible by car. The kids called it the bulldozer spot because that's where old, non-functional cars were dumped. There were also dilapidated and abandoned cabins, which had been falling apart since they were children. The woman led the police to this location, and it turned out to be the piece of information they had been missing. On July 21st, the police headed to the specified location in Cedar Creek, specifically to the old cabin where Tony used to play with his friends in his childhood. Immediately, they detected a distinct smell, the unmistakable odor of decomposition. In the center of the dilapidated cabin, amidst piles of debris, they found a hole in the wooden floor. Inside, they discovered the bodies of 2 individuals, still dressed in their pajamas. Blood at the scene indicated that they were killed right there. The bodies had significantly decomposed, and investigators relied on dental records and DNA to confirm their identities. It was Rusty and Becky. Autopsies revealed that each of them had died from a single gunshot wound to the right temple, fired at close range. The discovery of the bodies dashed the last hopes of Becky and Russell's family to see them alive. It was even more difficult for them because they couldn't comprehend why someone would do such a thing. It was an execution-style murder. However, the investigators' task shifted from searching for bodies to finding the killer, and all circumstantial evidence pointed to one suspect. The police had another ace up their sleeve. Despite Tony's hardened criminal background, modern technology played a crucial role in the investigation. Officers revisited Tony's phone data and discovered that 3 of his close associates, his wife, Wendy Friend, his son, Philip Friend, and his nephew, Dusty Hicks, had followed a similar path to Tony on the night of April 17th, the day the couple went missing. If Tony remained tight-lipped, perhaps they could pressure one of them. Investigators identified 26-year-old Philip, Tony's son, as the weakest link among the accomplices. During the period between the couple's disappearance and the discovery of the bodies, Philip had been implicated in a theft and was serving time in prison. He had already experienced incarceration, so when detectives threatened him with charges of double homicide, he agreed to talk. On December 17th, the young man revealed that his father had offered him a job to ensure that 2 individuals would never celebrate another birthday. It was criminal slang for murder, and Philip understood the gravity of the task and agreed to it. So, on April 17th, according to the boy's account, his father, Wendy, Dusty, and he got into the car and headed to Rusty and Becky's house. Wendy stayed in the car while the others put on gloves, balaclavas, taped the cuffs of their sleeves and pants with tape to not leave a single hair at the crime scene, grabbed a bottle of cleaning solution with bleach, and headed towards the family's home. They destroyed the cameras and searched the entire house for a way inside, but they were unsuccessful. They were about to leave when Dusty noticed a partially open kitchen window. They cut through the protective screen, pushed the window open, and Tony helped Dusty crawl inside. Dusty then opened the back door. The accomplices then entered the couple's bedroom. They startled Rusty and Becky awake, and Dusty and Tony pointed their weapons at them. Naturally, they were terrified, begged for mercy, and didn't understand who had burst into their home and what they wanted. But the criminals had more important matters to attend to than explaining anything to their victims. They generously poured bleach all over the kitchen floor, took the computer where the surveillance camera footage was stored, and, after tying the victims' hands with zip ties, led them to the car. It's remarkable how much effort the accomplices put in to avoid getting caught. In light of this, it's simply astonishing that Tony himself confessed his involvement in this to a stranger in a bar. Be that as it may, they dropped off Wendy at home and went to the location chosen by Tony, now known to the police. The accomplices parked the car in a field right in front of the dense forest, so vast that no one would hear a gunshot or screams. Tony instructed Dusty and Philip to wait while he led the spouses away. In their pajamas, barefoot, at gunpoint, they obediently walked into the woods. It's hard to imagine what they were feeling at that moment. Surely they understood they wouldn't be coming back, but they obediently pressed forward. According to Philip, he and Dusty sat for 10 minutes when they heard a gunshot, and it was only another 10 minutes later that the second shot rang out. The horror those 10 minutes must have been for the second victim. Tony never revealed what happened in that abandoned shack in the middle of the dense forest. There are many self-evident assumptions about this, but due to lack of evidence, they remain just that. And Philip could only talk about what he knew for sure. And according to his admission, it was only when his father emerged from the darkness of the forest alone that he began to understand what they had just done. After Philip's confession, investigators had only one question left that demanded an answer, although they already suspected the answer. Why did his father decide to kill two people he had never even met before? For this job, he was promised $100,000. And for Philip, this was no secret. It was Rusty's uncle, Robert Campbell, and his wife, Carolyn, Tony's sister. It was Robert who was the mastermind behind the murder, planning the attack for a time when he himself was supposed to be away in Texas. In fact, aside from disputes over the 49-hectare plot of land they lived on, he had a second motive. Robert was selling stolen equipment and using his property for these purposes. Rusty and Becky didn't like this, and they weren't going to stay silent about it. They raised a fuss that annoyed Robert. Becky was very afraid that unknown individuals were lurking around their home, so her husband installed cameras facing different directions from the house. Irritated by their behavior, Robert decided to get rid of them, to silence them forever. Naturally, he turned to Tony, a hardened criminal, and conveniently enough, his wife's brother. As the police learned, he approached Tony with a request to kill his nephew. Tony inquired about Becky, to which Robert coldly replied, "If she's there too, then kill her too." Tony agreed. Robert was arrested, but he stubbornly denied everything. He constantly reminded the investigators that he had an alibi. When the charges were brought against him, Tony and Dusty pleaded guilty. Tony and Dusty were sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for first-degree murder. Wendy decided to try her luck in court, was found guilty, and received a similar punishment. Robert also opted for trial, which made prosecutors nervous. Except for Philip's testimony, they had nothing solid against him. However, Philip agreed to testify against him and performed well in court. It was thanks to him that Robert was convicted. He was found guilty of 2 counts of second-degree murder. He will never see the light of day again. For his cooperation and willingness to plead guilty, Philip was sentenced to 13 years. Robert's wife, Carolyn, took her own life, unable to bear it all. She faced charges only for perjury. Arguments in people's lives are common and inevitable, and nobody really expects that a dispute will result in such consequences as murder. Becky and Rusty didn't like Robert's illegal side job, and they didn't hesitate to speak out about it directly. They knew it was dangerous. Becky openly feared the suspicious individuals who appeared near their home, and Rusty even installed a series of cameras to protect his wife. Unfortunately, it didn't save them. On that fateful night, when the couple walked into the woods in their pajamas and barefoot, did they suspect that Uncle Robert was to blame, wishing to get rid of the troublesome nephew and free up the house? Did the killer say anything to them before pulling the trigger? Or did the spouses believe to the last that it was some random attack, and the quarrels with Uncle Robert were just silly arguments, and he would never harm his nephew and his wife? Kauai is the Hawaiian island garden, rightfully bearing the title of one of the most beautiful places on Earth. Tourists come here to enjoy an unforgettable vacation, with jagged coastal cliffs, lush tropical forests, and no one notices the not-so-young man alone, handing out leaflets and telling the story of his brutally murdered daughter, Sandra. When Sandra Gallas was found strangled, the police quickly narrowed down the suspects to 2. The case seemed crystal clear and straightforward, but it took many years before justice prevailed, all thanks to one determined father. Standing at his daughter's grave, he vowed that as long as he lived, she would not be forgotten, and her case would be solved. This is the story of a father who remained the driving force behind the investigation, setting himself the goal of securing the conviction of his daughter's killer and allowing nothing to stand in his way. Sandra, the daughter of Toshi and Larry Mendonca, was born in Japan, her mother's homeland. However, the family later decided to move to the island of Kauai, closer to Larry's parents, as they were getting older and needed assistance. The family lived on a ranch, and Sandra and her older brother Lawrence Jr. adored the place. Few children could boast of having a waterfall right by their home. They spent a lot of time walking on the beach, swimming, and when they got hungry, they were surrounded by 2 fruit orchards where mangoes and citrus fruits grew. Sandra was very determined, responsible, and achieved her goals. From the age of 5, Sandra practiced gymnastics, performed in a cheerleading group at school, continued to participate in sports, and attended numerous clubs and groups, all while being raised in an environment that valued both Japanese and Portuguese traditions. The family's father, Larry, was a veteran of the Air Force, raising his children with discipline. In fact, He sought to instill independence and self-reliance in his daughter and son, insisting that Sandra pursue her higher education in Honolulu. The city seemed enormous to the girl from the small island, but she missed her native island of Kauai and her family, and visited as often as she could. It was during one of these visits that she met Darren. During the summer break of 1999, Sandra found temporary work at a transportation company where she met her future husband, Darren Gallas. She was 21, he was closer to 30, and he immediately captivated the young, inexperienced girl. She fell head over heels for him, dropped out of university, and soon the young couple got married. 9 months later, their first child, Austin, was born, followed by Braden 2 years later. Sandra adored her boys, and the family life seemed happy until April 2005, when she went to her parents, visibly distraught. She told them that while she was taking things out of her husband's backpack, 2 slips of paper fell out, each with a different phone number. Sandra called these numbers and found out they belonged to 2 different married women. She demanded an explanation from her husband. He didn't admit to anything, insisting that he only had friendly relationships with the women. But Sandra knew it was a lie and realized she couldn't forgive her husband. By June, Darren had moved out of the family home, leaving Sandra to deal with the bills on her own. She began searching for work and landed a job as an assistant manager at a highly popular restaurant, considered one of the island's landmarks. Sandra seamlessly integrated into the restaurant staff, earning the appreciation of her colleagues, who joyfully watched as the quiet girl from the small island transformed into a confident, independent woman. She changed her image, spending more time with friends and relishing her newfound freedom. Moreover, she started receiving attention from one of the restaurant's chefs named Ryan Shinjo, who had recently moved to Kauai from Oahu. Sandra found these attentions very pleasing. Sandra's relationship with Ryan was nothing like her relationship with her ex-husband. The couple spent a lot of time together, going out, relaxing, attending concerts, and even traveling to Honolulu for shopping trips, where Ryan spoiled Sandra with expensive gifts, such as Louis Vuitton suitcases. It seemed that Sandra was very happy with her new boyfriend, and a new beautiful chapter of her life had begun. This continued until January 25, 2006, when Sandra's boss called her parents asking if they knew where their daughter was because she hadn't shown up for work. It was unusual for Sandra to miss work and not answer calls, but her parents, who were visiting her older brother in Dallas at the time, weren't worried, thinking she might have some urgent matters to attend to. However, at 3 o'clock in the morning, another call came in, a time when bad news usually arrives. Sandra's brother answered the call. Their father understood everything when he heard his son's prolonged scream, "No!" He would never forget that cry, dividing his life into before and after the murder of his daughter. Sandra was found by her boyfriend Ryan. Since no one could reach her at 9:30 p.m., he went to check if she was home. The door was locked and no one answered. However, he went around the house, looked through the ventilation gap below the garage, and thought he saw a girl in the car. He couldn't open the garage himself, so he called a friend who quickly arrived with tools. Sandra was indeed lying in the car. She was slumped to the right on the passenger seat, face down. Her body had long gone cold. Sandra's shirt and bra were twisted. Bruises adorned her face. Her lip was split, and there were clear marks on her neck from strangulation. She had been choked with something thin, resembling fishing line. However, the arriving police officers couldn't find anything resembling a murder weapon. The girl was killed early in the morning, 10 hours before Ryan arrived, but it was impossible to determine the exact time of death. All of Sandra's belongings, including her phone, remained in place. Nothing was missing from her purse, car, or home. There were also no signs of violence. In other words, it was obvious that whoever killed Sandra did so in a fit of rage. Fingerprints of Darren and Ryan were found, but since one of them had lived in the house until recently and the other had been in a relationship with her, it didn't raise suspicions. However, the fact that Ryan found the body raised questions. Why didn't he call 911 immediately and instead first asked a friend to come over? This wouldn't be the first time a killer tries to establish an alibi by enlisting a friend's support. During questioning, Ryan behaved strangely, clearly nervous, and officers felt he was withholding something. However, he had an alibi. He was at work, confirmed by his colleagues. Darren, on the other hand, was more intriguing. That morning, he called in sick to work, essentially lacking an alibi. Darren showed no reaction to Sandra's death but told investigators that he still loved his wife and wanted to reconcile. His colleagues revealed that 2 days before the murder, Darren, working on the road, saw Sandra and Ryan together as they drove past in her car. Witnesses said Darren exploded with rage. He was furious, tearing and throwing things. In other words, he had a motive and lacked an alibi for the time of the murder. He was detained, but the next day, lacking additional evidence, he was released. Days, weeks, and months passed without any progress in the case. Crushed by loss and yearning for answers, Sandra's father, Larry Mendonca, began his own investigation. A local resident and former military man, he had the connections and skills to piece together all the facts surrounding his daughter's murder. At that time, and this is crucial for the case, Sandra and Darren were disputing custody of their 2 sons. But Sandra worked evenings at the restaurant, and the boys stayed overnight with Darren. Sandra would pick them up at 6 in the morning, feed them breakfast, and get them ready for school and daycare. However, Larry learned that on the evening before her murder, Sandra stayed overnight at her boyfriend's house. He drove her home around 6 in the morning. Then, according to neighbors, she went to pick up the boys and quickly returned, but without the children. Larry also discovered that at 10 o'clock, his daughter had an appointment for a manicure at a salon 45 minutes away from her home. She never showed up. This helped narrow down the time frame when she was killed, from 6:30 to 9:15 in the morning, when she needed to leave to make it to the salon. Since Ryan had an alibi and Darren didn't, Larry's thoughts moved in the same direction as the investigators. Darren must have been the one to kill Sandra. There was no one else. Sandra's friend confirmed that many of her friends were convinced Darren would be arrested and convicted. The children would be placed under the custody of their grandparents or Sandra's brother, and everything would be resolved. But the police were in no hurry to press charges. Then, a year after the murder, news of an arrest spread. But it wasn't Darren. The island of Kauai is unique in many aspects, particularly in its lack of mass media. In most cases, news spreads the same way it did generations ago, through word of mouth, where facts, rumors, and speculations intertwine into a single narrative. Thus, across the island, new information began to circulate. FBI agents had arrested Ryan Shinjo. However, it wasn't in connection with the murder, but rather with illicit substances. Ryan turned out to be a member of a major organization smuggling these substances to the island from Honolulu. It involved significant amounts of money and serious shipments, and FBI agents had been monitoring Ryan for months. Rumors and speculations began to spread across the island. Could Ryan have used his girlfriend as an unsuspecting carrier of the goods? After all, he bought her Louis Vuitton suitcases. Did she unknowingly bring something back from their trip that she wasn't aware of? What if she discovered the truth and she was killed to prevent her from going to the police? Rumors abounded, but the police didn't come any closer to catching the girl's killer, whoever they might be. The case faded away with each passing year. Meanwhile, Larry and Toshi faced the painful reality of not only losing their daughter but also their grandchildren. When their mother was killed, they were only 3 and 5 years old. Darren no longer needed to fight for custody, and he raised the children on his own. Initially, the grandchildren would visit their grandparents on weekends, but within 3 months, they started protesting against these trips. Larry persisted in trying to maintain a relationship with his grandchildren, but it was evident that Darren was turning the children against their late mother's parents. Darren himself appeared everywhere with his new girlfriend Sharon, whom he knew even before Sandra's murder. Then, in 2009, 3 years after his daughter's murder, Larry began to conceive a dark plan for revenge for her death. Fortunately, his plans were put on hold when a new police chief arrived on the island of Kauai, bringing renewed hope for justice to Larry. Police Chief Darryl Perry had been enjoying retirement, but returned to work after the sudden loss of his 26-year-old son. Therefore, he understood the pain of a father who lost a child. After a very emotional meeting with Larry, Chief Perry resolved that Sandra Gallas's case must be solved at all costs. The new police chief enlisted the help of 2 friends in Honolulu, investigators from the cold case department, to review Sandra's case. Perhaps they could notice something that had been overlooked, and indeed, they managed to discover something using advancements that were cutting edge for 2009. Forensic scientists had the capability to extract DNA from an item touched only once. With this technology, they found Darren's DNA on the victim's shirt and bra. Larry hoped that they were getting closer to solving the case, and the police thought an arrest was imminent. However, the prosecutor deemed it insufficient evidence because Darren never denied seeing his wife every day. The investigation stalled once again. Years continued to pass one after another. In 2012, the police chief assigned the case to a new detective, Bryson Ponce, who thoroughly reviewed all the evidence. The investigation led Bryson Ponce back to the same two initial suspects. But which one was the murderer? What evidence pointed against Ryan? Aside from his involvement in smuggling illicit substances, there was something suspicious about how he found the girl's body. He couldn't enter the garage through the closed door and had to call a friend who helped him open it. Perhaps he was seeking to secure a witness. Moreover, he clearly had something to hide and failed a polygraph test. But didn't he have an alibi? Here was another twist. As the new investigator discovered, the time of Sandra's death was more of an estimation. She could have been killed hours earlier when Ryan wasn't at work. However, Darren's position wasn't much more reliable, primarily because he provided completely different statements regarding the events of that morning. Initially, he claimed that Sandra had stopped by to pick up the boys. Then he corrected himself, saying she didn't stop by. He also failed the polygraph test. But here's what's interesting. The couple were battling for custody, and Darren had the idea to keep a diary where he recorded all of his wife's shortcomings, such as when she failed to pick up the children on time. He hoped this would help him gain full custody. Reviewing the diary, investigator Bryson Ponce noticed that entries were made every day from January 1st until the 24th. But on the 25th, the day of the murder, it was blank. If Sandra hadn't shown up at all to pick up the children, Darren would have definitely noted it, given how detailed his previous entries were. Such a gift from her side he wouldn't have missed. After all, he couldn't have known about her death until late in the evening at the earliest. Interestingly, he didn't even call his wife to clarify when she would arrive, perhaps because he knew very well that she would never arrive again. The investigator found something else. Just 3 weeks before Sandra's death, she sent emails to her lawyer describing her husband as a cruel, dangerous man who viewed her as his property and was jealous of Ryan. She detailed how her husband grabbed her, shook her violently, and yelled at her never to call her boyfriend again. He also used the children to his advantage. When Sandra came to pick up the boys at 6 in the morning, he would refuse to open the door for a long time, shouting that he didn't want to wake up so early and demanding that she leave his house because she was allegedly intruding on his property, although he knew perfectly well that the children needed to be fed and taken to school and daycare. After conducting a thorough investigation, Bryson Ponce concluded that on that morning, Sandra did indeed come for the children, but she and Darren had a quarrel, and she was forced to leave without them. Darren, still enraged after the argument, followed her, parked his car on the street a little further from Sandra's house to avoid being noticed by neighbors, and when his wife got out of the car, he attacked her. Then, he simply went back home to the children. The investigator submitted the final report to the police chief and the prosecutor. The district attorney finally agreed to bring the case to trial because everyone believed that no one else but Ponce could do more for the case, and they would not find any new evidence. Darren was charged with his wife's murder. He pleaded not guilty and was released on bail. Sandra's relatives thought that the trial was imminent, but they were mistaken. Unexpected circumstances intervened. The district attorney, who agreed to bring Darren's case to trial, lost during re-election to her post, and her successor criticized her work. He stated that she tried to use the high-profile murder case for her own purposes, hoping it would increase her chances of re-election. The new district attorney was convinced that they would not win the case in court because there were two suspects, and the defense would never let this fact rest. And in this case, the second suspect was a convicted felon serving time in federal prison. The court date kept getting postponed, and Larry Mendonca was not getting any younger. He feared that the promise of achieving justice, which he made at his daughter's grave, might not come to fruition, and these thoughts wore him down. Early in the morning on February 14, 2017, the 75-year-old Larry felt unwell. He was taken to the hospital with a heart attack. It was difficult for his son and wife to see him lying in the hospital bed. His condition was quite serious, but he managed to pull through. For months, he underwent physical therapy to be ready for the trial in the summer of 2017, but it was postponed once again. Meanwhile, Darren, his former son-in-law, continued to live his life, attending his children's football games with his new wife, Sharon. In 2017, Ryan Shindo, who had served 10 years in federal prison, was released and decided to speak with the prosecutor. He revealed that he and Sandra had been afraid of Darren because of his aggressive behavior, constantly provoking Ryan to fights. After one altercation at a restaurant, Sandra shouted at her husband, "Don't you dare hit me, Darren." She confessed that he had already allowed himself to hit her. Despite his criminal record, Ryan was not inherently aggressive, unlike Darren, and fully cooperated with the investigation. Finally, at the end of 2017, the district attorney decided that his investigators had completely ruled out Ryan as a suspect, and Darren could be tried for second-degree murder. Suddenly, Darren's lawyer shocked everyone by stating that his client was willing to make a deal with the prosecution, but on his own terms. He agreed not to contest the charge of first-degree assault. In other words, he did not admit guilt in the murder or the assault. However, he agreed to accept punishment for the first-degree assault for causing serious injuries to Sandra. It sounded like mockery of justice, but the prosecutor still wasn't sure if he could prove the man's guilt in the murder and agreed to the deal. Larry Mendonza was disappointed and angry. In 2017, Darren could have been sentenced to either 10 years in prison or probation. This meant that despite brutally strangling his wife, he might not spend a single day behind bars. Everything was supposed to be decided on May 30th, 2018. Larry awaited the start of the trial with a large support group, family members, friends who knew Sandra, and people advocating for justice. 12 years of investigation condensed into an hour of trial. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Would the judge send the defendant home or to prison? As expected, the defense attorney reminded the judge of the alternative suspect. He also reiterated that this was not a murder case, and his client did not admit guilt in anything, only agreeing to punishment for assaulting his wife. Larry also spoke in court. He was given the opportunity to unleash 12 years of pain and despair, starting from that dreadful night when he informed his daughter's mother of her death. How do you tell a woman that the little girl who once fell asleep in her arms, played on her knees, ran to school clutching the lunch she made for her, is gone? Looking at Darren, Larry declared, his family received a life sentence, full of pain, sorrow, and disappointment. A lifelong imprisonment, forever. Darren didn't react to this statement as if it had nothing to do with him. It was time for the judge's decision. Larry was on pins and needles. The judge reiterated the defense attorney's words about the deal and what the defendant agreed to. The attorney whispered to Larry that it didn't promise anything worthwhile. But no, the judge sentenced Darren to the maximum possible term of imprisonment, 10 years. Darren appealed, and his sentence was reduced. But the 12-year struggle for justice for the Mendonza family had come to an end. Larry, Toshi, and their son Lawrence established a foundation and hold annual golf tournaments to raise funds to help victims of domestic violence and to ensure that the public does not forget Sandra's death. Unfortunately, Larry and Toshi failed to reconcile with their grandchildren, who are convinced of their father's innocence and hate their grandparents and even their late mother. By seeking justice for their daughter, Larry and Toshi foresaw this but couldn't act differently. All they have left today are a few rituals on the anniversary of Sandra's death. They bring flowers to her memorial, dine at the restaurant where she worked, and visit the grave where Sandra rests among her ancestors. Sandra, who longed for her native island while away from it, is now forever a part of it. The offended ex-husband, the jealous, despotic boyfriend, the rejected suitor, a one-night stand partner, a teenager with a string of police involvements, or a niece with a better friend. One of these people killed a loving, caring, joyful mother of 3, sending the police on the trail of possible leads to catch the murderer and attempting to seek justice for the victim and her family. The question remains, will justice be served? Nature generously endowed Dana Laskovski with the best qualities one could find in a person. At 36, Dana was a very beautiful and lively woman, a kind and responsive friend, a talented artist, and a loving mother. Children constituted the most important part of Dana's life. Above all else in the world, she wanted to be a mother, but for some time, she and her husband Sam struggled to have children. However, when their family expanded to 3, Dana and Sam's happiness knew no bounds. Yet in 2000, the couple separated, and Dana, along with the children, moved to a new home in the charming town of Puyallup, Washington. In 2001, she turned her love for children into a profession. Someday she dreamed of opening her own daycare, but for the time being, she worked as a nanny. In addition to this, Dana actively supported her 17-year-old niece, Amanda, during times of difficulty with her parents. For Amanda and her best friend, Emily, Dana was the aunt that every teenager dreams of having. The girls often stayed overnight at Dana's, sought her advice on any matter, and in general considered her more of an older friend than an aunt. The rest of the important people in Dana's life included Mike, whom she met approximately a year after parting ways with her husband. Mike was a pleasant man residing in Canada, but made the effort to visit Dana as often as possible, especially since the drive wasn't too time-consuming. Unfortunately, not everything was smooth in their relationship. Dana's best friend, Shauna, and Mike's best friend, John, didn't speak highly of Mike. The main issue in their relationship was that Dana was a very beautiful woman who often attracted the attention of other men, something that, to put it mildly, did not sit well with Mike. And one of the men who showed interest in Dana, thereby irritating Mike, was Patrick. Patrick worked for a telecommunications company and met Dana when he connected her television after her move. The new neighbor immediately caught Patrick's eye, but she politely rejected his advances. However, he continued to send her flowers and love notes persistently. Initially, Dana probably considered these gestures harmless. When Mike saw flowers from a competitor, he became jealous and very angry. He demanded Patrick's phone number and address, promising to deal with the persistent suitor the same day. Dana did not appreciate this. Firstly, she just wanted to continue ignoring Patrick. Secondly, she didn't want her boyfriend making decisions for her. Mike and Dana argued, and they even decided to temporarily part ways. During this period in August 2001, which coincidentally preceded Dana's death, she had dinner with her friend Shauna. To their surprise, Mike's best friend John joined them. John had recently broken up with his girlfriend, and Dana and Mike were on a break in their relationship. That evening, fueled by alcohol and caught up in the moment, they became involved with each other, much to Mike's dismay. Literally the next day, Dana received a note from her admirer Patrick, in which threatening undertones prevailed. It was probably only then that Dana realized she had a stalker. Patrick hinted that he had been watching her in her home. To her horror, upon inspecting her rooms, she indeed noticed that the protective screen had been removed from the window, as if someone had entered her home that way. Coincidentally, in August 2001, Dana's ex-husband Sam attempted to re-enter her life. Sam arrived unannounced to inform her that he had sold their house. For months after their separation, they had been trying to sell the house, so he bought a bottle of champagne to celebrate this development. Sam hinted at wanting to reconcile, expressing that he wasn't ready for a divorce, but they ended up having another argument, and Sam had to leave. On August 31st, 2001, the family for whom Dana worked as a nanny couldn't reach her. Dana never missed work, and certainly not without informing her employers. The family tried contacting Dana's neighbors, but they also couldn't get through to her. Concerned, they called the police and requested a welfare check to ensure everything was okay. When the police arrived at Dana's home, they knocked on the door. Getting no response, they circled the house and found the back door slightly ajar. Upon entering, they walked through the kitchen and discovered a woman lying face down on the couch. It was Dana, and she was dead. She lay in an unnatural position, with one arm above her head and the other beneath her body twisted in a strange way. Dana's neck showed signs of bruising. It was evident that she had been murdered. The officers immediately secured the crime scene and called in detectives. Examining the crime scene and finding bloodstains on the carpet, investigators concluded that Dana had struggled with someone before her death. After the murder, the assailant placed her on the couch, added a pillow, and covered her with a blanket, as if attempting to make her more comfortable. This strongly suggested that the crime was committed by someone known to Dana. On the other hand, a broken window hinted at a possible robbery gone wrong, especially considering the entire house had been ransacked in search of something. Investigators were perplexed, with half the evidence indicating a personal vendetta and the other half suggesting a robbery. After the autopsy, the forensic pathologist confirmed that Dana had been strangled. The murder was characterized by extreme brutality. Initially, she was severely struck on the head before being strangled, resulting in a broken trachea. This level of force indicated a very strong perpetrator. It seemed likely that the attack was not premeditated, as the killer had to pass through the kitchen, where knives were available, but chose not to use them, and instead opted for bare hands. When a wife is murdered, one of the first focuses of the police is on the husband. It quickly emerged that Sam had taken out a substantial life insurance policy on his wife. The police rushed to find him, but Sam had seemingly disappeared, becoming the prime suspect. As it turned out, Sam had gone on a camping trip with the children. He had no mobile reception throughout the night and was unaware of Dana's death until he returned to civilization and received a barrage of calls and messages. When detectives finally managed to speak with Sam, they noticed bruises on his knees. He explained that he was into baseball and got the bruises during a training session. Regarding his relationship with his wife, Sam mentioned they were not living together, had arguments, but were trying to compromise. When asked where he was on August 30th at the time of the murder, Sam said he was at home with the children, briefly left while they were sleeping, but only to refuel before his upcoming trip. Since Sam couldn't definitively prove where he was at the time of the crime and was not overly cooperative with the police, investigators tried to build a case suggesting he might have gone to see his wife on August 30th, perhaps to discuss child custody, had an argument, and killed Dana. However, his actions didn't fit the timeline of the crime. It seemed implausible for Sam to put the triplets to bed, drive 2 hours to his wife's house just to argue and kill her, then make his way back and nonchalantly take the children for a relaxing outing the next morning. This version of events didn't withstand scrutiny, but suspicions weren't entirely lifted from him either. Surveying friends and family of Dana, investigators shifted their focus to a more likely suspect, Patrick, who had been harassing the woman. Shortly before her death, Dana told friends that Patrick had become fixated on her. She realized he was truly stalking her because he knew about things he couldn't have learned through other means. It reached a point where Dana informed the family she worked for that if she were to die unexpectedly, Patrick would be to blame. Adding to this, witnesses had seen a white van, similar to Patrick's, near Dana's house in the days leading up to the crime, painting a less favorable picture for the investigator. The police obtained a warrant to collect Patrick's DNA and search his home and van. Patrick reacted harshly, being rude and uncooperative when they arrived. However, as officers began the search, Patrick reviewed the search warrant and only then realized they were investigating Dana's murder. He had initially thought they had come to arrest him for harassment. Once he grasped the gravity of the situation, his behavior immediately changed. Patrick agreed to provide fingerprints, a DNA sample, anything to assist the investigation. He also mentioned his whereabouts on the night of the murder. After work, he stayed late with friends. His alibi was fully corroborated. Detectives reluctantly had to acknowledge that Patrick had been incredibly lucky because many witnesses and circumstantial evidence had pointed to him. Deprived of a potential suspect, investigators turned their attention to Mike, Dana's boyfriend. However, before they could talk to the Canadian, they discovered interesting information about him. Dana's best friend, Shauna, reluctantly admitted that Dana was unhappy with Mike's constant control lately. Additionally, Dana had cheated on Mike with his best friend, John. Curiously, John was genuinely in love with Dana, desired a serious relationship, and believed Mike wasn't a suitable match for her. In Dana's infidelity with John, investigators saw a clear motive. Mike could have committed the crime out of revenge, aligning with the theory that the attacker was someone Dana knew. When investigators traveled to Canada and spoke with Mike in person, they saw a man deeply affected by the loss of his loved one. He disclosed that he was already aware of the infidelity and had forgiven Dana. On the night of the crime, he couldn't reach Dana by phone. Displeased with how their last meeting ended, he decided to drive to her. Investigators were optimistic, thinking they finally had a breakthrough in the case with a suitable motive, jealousy. However, Mike continued his narrative, revealing that he was stopped by Border Patrol. They halted him, then turned him back because his driver's license had expired. This information was confirmed by Border Control. While investigators considered the possibility that Mike might have found another way to enter the States, they were beginning to realize that this was yet another dead end. All the likely suspects in Dana's murder had alibis. Frustrated after 5 months of investigation, the Washington police sought assistance from an FBI profiler to help them create a profile of the perpetrator. Notably, they hadn't completely ruled out Dana's husband Sam as a suspect at that point. However, the profiler confidently stated that Sam wasn't the one who killed his wife. If Sam had committed the crime, it would have been planned, and he would have used a weapon. Moreover, Sam could have easily devised an attack plan during the 2-hour drive from his home to hers. The crime wouldn't have occurred on a day when he had custody of the children. Even if it was an unplanned attack, there would have been bruises on Dana's face, because a man in a fit of rage would start with facial blows. Shocked by the news of Sam's innocence, the profiler asked if any of the people they interviewed displayed signs of remorse. He reminded the detectives that Dana knew her killer, and they were now searching for someone haunted by guilt. The police tried to look at the case from a different angle. It was then that they discovered something that matched this rather specific characteristic. In the book where guests could leave farewell messages at Dana's funeral, Amanda, her niece, left a rather interesting note. She apologized to her aunt for not being the best niece and wrote that she had been sober for 37 days, refraining from any prohibited substances. In principle, these words did not contain anything incriminating, especially considering that the girl had lost her beloved aunt, who had always been a friend and support to her. Nevertheless, there was something in them that made the investigators take a closer look at her. Amanda was invited to the police station for questioning. Now, with Dana, her protector, absent from her life, Amanda found herself in even worse company than before. The girl was genuinely devastated by Dana's murder and shared that her aunt had always been the person she could turn to when she had problems or when her relationship with her parents was strained. The police asked Amanda if she knew anyone who would go as far as to murder a woman who cared so much for her. They reminded her of how horrifying the last moments of her aunt's life were, possibly even showing her some images, and the girl broke down. She provided the police with the name of one of her friends, Blaine. Amanda told the police that Blaine had a violent temper and had once tried to push her onto the couch and assault her when she rejected his advances. She added that he had also been in Dana's house, and after her murder, he observed the crime scene from across the street while forensic experts worked. Furthermore, after her aunt's murder, she noticed scratches on his hands. Digging into Blaine's past, the police found that he had a history of various offenses. They were eager to talk to him, but there was a problem. Blaine had disappeared. He was living in a southern state, making extradition difficult, and he showed no willingness to cooperate voluntarily. Trying to find a way to question him, the detectives decided to start with interviewing his friends. This led them to his friend, who happened to be in jail at that time. When they explained that they wanted to question Blaine as a suspect in Dana Laskovski's murder, the friend exclaimed, "Wait, Blaine didn't kill Dana. Emily killed Amanda's aunt." Emily, Amanda's close friend who frequently visited Dana's house. The friend added that there was no doubt that Emily did it. They had long nicknamed her Mutant because of her inhuman strength. Emily could defeat anyone in arm wrestling, and her favorite move involved a grip that allowed her to practically choke her sparring partner. It was at this point that investigators realized they had overlooked a potential suspect who stood at only 158 centimeters tall and weighed 54 kilograms. The police brought Emily to the station. She was clearly not inclined to cooperate. She behaved overly confidently, was rude to the police, and when they listed all the witnesses pointing to her, she became furious and declared that she had nothing to do with the crime. She couldn't provide an alibi either. The police obtained a search warrant for her residence, where they found a blouse stolen from Dana. Apparently, Blaine's friends had pointed them to this detail. They revealed that Emily not only stole the blouse, but also appeared in it at Dana's funeral. In Emily's apartment, the police also found the girl's diary containing several intriguing entries. Firstly, Emily wrote about Amanda, stating that she could strangle that wretch, just like her aunt. Secondly, the girl had a to-do list for her life, and among the 10 various points, one stood out: kill someone and not get caught. These entries provided a kind of admission and motive, but the detectives understood that this was not sufficient for a confession. Moreover, any defense attorney could easily challenge such evidence. What a 17-year-old girl wrote in her diary might not be taken seriously in court. The police needed to get Amanda's confession. They invited the girl to the station again, this time directly accusing her of leading them astray several times and threatening to charge her as an accomplice. Under pressure, she revealed everything. On the evening of August 30th, when they went to her aunt with Emily, they were under the influence of illicit substances. The teenagers wanted to ask Dana for money, but Emily behaved strangely, rudely, and sharply towards the homeowner, forcing her to ask the girls to leave. Emily refused to leave. Then Dana gently touched the girl's shoulder to escort her to the door, but Emily suddenly became furious. She struck Dana on the head. Interestingly, this detail was not reported by the media, so Amanda could only have known it if she had truly witnessed the murder. After that, Emily applied a choking technique, just as Blaine's friends described. She used a scarf to strangle Dana, showing no intention of stopping. Amanda turned away, unable to watch what was happening. She heard a crunch, then wheezing, And finally, it became very quiet. Dana was dead. The girls took the money they could find and left. Amanda admitted that she did not expect everything to end this way. She thought Emily would simply anger Dana to the point where she would forbid them from coming to her home again. Detectives now understood that the crime was both an attack on a carefully chosen victim and a robbery. On the one hand, the girls needed money. On the other, Emily envied her friend's relationship with her aunt, and out of jealousy, she decided to get rid of Dana once and for all. On March 13, 2003, Emily Lonborg was charged with first-degree murder. She had already turned 18, and they were planning to try her as an adult. However, prosecutors were not confident they could secure a conviction. Emily did not confess to anything. The testimony of Amanda played a significant role, but it couldn't be relied upon since, upon seeing her friend in the defendant's seat, Amanda might retract her statements. If charges were brought against Amanda, she could invoke the right to remain silent. Even with Amanda's testimony, prosecutors were uncertain they could convince the jury that a petite teenage girl could strangle an adult woman with her bare hands. They made what was perhaps the right decision in this case. They negotiated a deal. Emily admitted guilt to involuntary manslaughter and received less than 7 years of imprisonment. Amanda was not charged. Justice, to some extent, prevailed. However, this case leaves a bitter taste because, in prison, Emily exhibited model behavior. Additionally, the time she spent in pre-trial detention was counted towards her sentence. Therefore, after just 5.5 years, she became a free person. She got married, changed her name, and became a mother. Emily Lonborg, who left 3 children without a loving mother, now enjoys the life she stole from her victim. In July 2019, an unprecedented scandal erupted in Romania, demonstrating how the police respond to calls to the emergency service. The call to number 112 was received on July 25th at 11:05. The caller, a 15-year-old schoolgirl named Alexandra Masisanu, struggling to speak, told the operator that she had been kidnapped, beaten, assaulted, and was being held against her will in some house.
Alo?
Bună ziua!
Bună ziua!
Vreau și în legătură cu poliția.
Da. Ce s-a întâmplat?
Doamnă,
Nu vă numiți.
sunt domnișoara, am 15 ani și ieri am fost sechestrată de către un domn.
Cum te cheamă?
She didn't know where she was, but only knew that she was in the city of Caracal. Before the call was interrupted, the operator sarcastically asked how they would find her if she didn't tell them her location.
Mă cheamă Alexandra, vă rog, veniți repede, nu știu unde sunt.
Cum adică nu știi unde ești? În ce localitate te afli?
În Caracal, m-a dus în Caracal, dar nu știu unde exact.
Păi dă-mi un de reper unde te afli în Caracal. Cum crezi că te găsim?
Fortunately, Alexandra called again at 11:06, and the operator once again tried to ascertain her location. The girl managed to provide important details. For example, she had seen a dam before the kidnapper blindfolded her eyes. He had a gray car, and she was being held in a very old, dilapidated house near a gas station. There was a lot of grass and bushes in the yard, as well as 2 dogs. She even mentioned a name and an address that she read from a business card she found, and explained that she was calling from the kidnapper's phone. The operator relayed the situation to a police officer who continued to communicate with the girl. He told her to stay where she was because they were sending a team. Alexandra tried to provide more description of the kidnapper's car in the yard, but the police officer wasn't listening anymore. The schoolgirl called again at 11:12 and asked if they had sent anyone to help her. Another police officer replied irritably that the team had already been dispatched but couldn't reach her in 2 minutes. Alexandra begged the police officer to stay on the line with her because she was terrified, but he responded that they had other calls to attend to. "The team will arrive in 2 or 3 minutes, what the hell?" he added. The girl reluctantly agreed. Although the emergency services personnel knew that the kidnapper was supposed to return any minute, they inexplicably called Alexandra 9 more times, but no one answered. Not surprisingly, even if the girl had initially tried to discreetly place the phone back, the kidnapper now knew for certain that she had called the police. 12 hours after Alexandra's call, the police finally brought her father to the station, allowed him to listen to the emergency call, and asked if he recognized his daughter's voice. When the man confirmed that it was her voice, they believed it was not a prank, and only then did they begin their investigation. Unfortunately, the name on the business card Alexandra found belonged to a man who had no connection to the case, and the specialized telecommunications service couldn't trace the origin of the call. Technicians were able to provide the officers with a very wide search radius and 3 possible locations for the girl, but none of the specified locations were correct. At that point, the police turned to surveillance camera recordings to identify a vehicle involved in a similar case. Once they identified the driver, they surrounded his house. Despite not being legally required, the police applied for a warrant and simply waited. They received the warrant at 6 in the morning on July 26th, a staggering 19 hours after Alexandra's call. Only then did they knock on the suspect's house gate. Of course, they were late. Inside the house, they found Alexandra's clothes and jewelry in the car, the girl's earring, and in the yard, a metallic barrel with ashes and human remains. The man stated that he doesn't know any Alexandru Mașișanu, and the ashes in the barrel remained after the fire he lit to defend himself from persistent mosquitoes. However, after a thorough examination of the barrel's contents, investigators found 6 teeth. The results of the laboratory analysis left no room for doubt. The teeth belonged to Alexandra. The police arrested the homeowner, 66-year-old Gheorghe Dinca, a retired mechanic. Neighbors knew Gheorghe as an aggressive and inhumane person. So inhumane that he had a special code for his rare visitors. 3 knocks on the door. He suffered from antisocial personality disorder, had been admitted to a mental institution 5 times, and his troubled childhood could have been a possible reason for his condition. Gheorghe's father worked as a butcher, engaging in illegal meat trade, often killing and butchering animals in front of his son, forcing the boy to assist. This soon became routine, and Gheorghe himself was already killing stray animals for his twisted pleasure. His father was a heavy drinker and frequently beat the boy, using belts, brooms, and even the hose from the washing machine multiple times a day. He also tied his son up with a wire to prevent him from going outside to play with other kids. Interestingly, later on, Gheorghe started treating his own victims the same way. Not surprisingly, the boy performed poorly in school. However, when he joined the army, it seemed like his life was getting on track, and he found his place, until he assaulted another soldier who turned out to be the son of a defense ministry official. Expelled from the army, Gheorghe returned home and got a job as a general laborer at a hospital. He worked there for 8 years before attempting to find work on construction sites in Italy. Once again, things didn't work out, as he was fired after brutally beating an Albanian worker. After attacking a young woman, he was deported from the country. Upon returning to Romania, he worked as a mechanic, drove taxis, and also collected and sold scrap metal. Despite his inhumane behavior and reclusiveness, he managed to start a family and became the father of 4 children. His wife, tired of his constant abuse, lived and worked in Italy. Sources close to Gheorghe say that when his wife came to Romania for the last time, he severely beat her. All 4 children left their father's house. 3 sons chose to live with their mother, while the daughter settled in Timisoara. After George's arrest, she insisted that she had no contact with her father, whom she considered mentally unstable. So, as it appears, Gheorghe Dinca was a recluse, living in isolation, and his behavioral issues couldn't resolve on their own. Another shocking piece of news shocked the public. Gheorghe confessed to the murder of the second girl, whom he abducted in April, 2 months prior to Alexandra's kidnapping. The second victim of the man was an 18-year-old named Luisa Melencu. Until the age of 12, Luisa lived in Italy with her mother, Monica Melencu, who worked there and engaged in vegetable cultivation. However, in search of a better life and income, Monica moved to the United Kingdom, while Luisa chose to finish school in her homeland and lived with her grandparents. She dedicated a lot of time to her studies and was determined to get an excellent education to find a job with a decent salary to support her family. But she relied on her mother's support for the time being. On April 14th, her mother sent her money for sports shoes. Luisa went to an ATM in Caracal, but for some reason, she couldn't withdraw money. She called her grandfather to let him know she was on her way home and headed to the bus stop. However, since it was Sunday and public transportation was scarce, especially in rural areas where locals often complained about its unreliability even on weekdays, Luisa decided to hitchhike. Unfortunately, Gheorghe Dinca was passing by. He agreed to give her a ride. Luisa struck up a conversation and told him about her failed attempt to get money from the ATM. Upon hearing this, Gheorghe offered her 30 lei, approximately $7, for intimate services. She refused, after which Gheorghe decided to take what he wanted by force. Meanwhile, Louisa's grandfather began to worry because he knew his granddaughter should have been home by now. He called her mobile phone, but she didn't answer. Recognizing this behavior as entirely out of character, he rushed to the police station to report her disappearance. However, the officers dismissed his concerns, attributing Louisa's absence to a potential romantic involvement. Left with no choice, Louisa's family started searching for her themselves, and her classmates spread information about her disappearance on social media. The next day, an unidentified man called Louisa's grandfather, assuring him that Louisa was fine but didn't want to talk to him. He added that they were planning to go to Switzerland together. Not believing a word of the stranger's claim, the grandfather made multiple attempts to contact the police but received no assistance. Louisa's mother, Monica, traveled from the UK, where she had been living and working, and had somewhat better luck with the police. Only on the fourth day did the police begin an investigation which seemed more like mockery of the relatives. Louisa's grandfather was subjected to a polygraph test because they suspected him of withholding information. Finally, on May 30th, the case was handed over to the Directorate for Investigating Organized Crime and Terrorism, DICOT, which announced the opening of a criminal case on June 6th. They decided to investigate Louisa's disappearance as a human trafficking case, as they saw signs that she might have been recruited against her will for sexual exploitation. DICOT continued their investigation when news broke about the disappearance of another girl, Alexandra Masishanu. A 15-year-old teenager from Dobrosloveni was a student in the 10th grade at one of the top schools in Caracal. On July 24th, Alexandra left her home at 10 o'clock in the morning to meet a friend from Caracal. No one else saw her after that. The girl's parents quickly turned to the police, but the officers did not take their concerns seriously, stating that she was old enough to go out with friends and lose track of time. They advised them to wait. When the truth about the two murders came to light, the criminal inaction and negligence of officials and law enforcement personnel triggered a massive political crisis in the country. Many government bodies tried to demonstrate their activity, showing that they were doing their job, but it did not help them. The Minister of the Interior, the head of the criminal police, the director of the rescue service, the police leadership, and the prosecution in Caracal were all dismissed. The Prime Minister dismissed the Minister of Education, who cynically remarked that young girls should think twice before getting into strangers' cars, as if she were unaware of the problems with public transportation in the country and the fact that hitchhiking is sometimes the only way to travel in small towns. The police claimed that the Special Telecommunications Service employees could not provide more precise information about the origins of the calls, leading to their search efforts being focused in the wrong places. However, the police were also criticized for their slow and chaotic response. Frustrated, the grandfather of Louisa labeled them as criminals being paid by the government to not do their job. At the same time, questions arose about the remains of the murdered girls. Here is where the most significant mystery of this story begins. Gheorghe stated that he burned the bodies. He scattered fragments of Louisa's bones in the forest and disposed of her clothes. However, he did not have time to do the same with Alexandra's clothes and body. Investigators reconstructed the crime scenes. Gheorghe was asked to guide the investigators step by step to all the places he had been on the days of the deaths of Louisa and Alexandra. At this point, he started to contradict himself in his statements, allegedly struggling to remember what he did at the time. According to criminologists, Gheorghe intentionally led them on a wild goose chase. Although he confessed to the two murders he was asked about, when he was requested to repeat his actions during the crimes and show where he left the remains, he panicked. This might be because he probably had a secret location where he hid all his victims. As there were likely more than 2 bodies in that hidden place, he led the investigators on a wild goose chase, pretending to be confused, not understanding and not remembering anything. Although fragments of bones were found in the forest, experts believed that the bodies were either in the Danube or the Olt River. In November 2019, while in prison, Gheorghe began to write a confession detailing what he had done to Louisa and Alexandra. He started his account with the incident on April 14th, when he stopped his car as Louise was hitchhiking on the road. He agreed to give her a ride and engaged in conversation with her during the journey. He realized that he was becoming sexually aroused. His thoughts were consumed by nothing else but fulfilling his own desires. The man offered the girl 30 Romanian lei, about $7, for intimate services. When she declined, he struck her in the face and bound her with a belt. Interestingly, Gheorghe also blindfolded her so that the victim wouldn't know the way to his house. Does this imply that he intended to release her alive? After parking the car at his house, the man noticed his 36-year-old neighbor, Stefan Repeziano, in the yard. Stefan occasionally helped Gheorghe clean up the yard. Seeing a beautiful young girl in the car, Stefan asked who she was. With no other option, Gheorghe said that he brought her for intimate services, and the neighbor asked to join him. Gheorghe agreed. The men subjected Louise to humiliation and continued to torment her for 4 days. On the morning of the 4th day, Gheorghe lost his temper when the girl tried to resist him for the last time. He violently beat her and left her in a pool of blood on the bed, briefly stepping out to feed otters. When he returned, it was already too late to help the girl. The man didn't panic. He placed her in a metallic barrel and set it on fire, covering it with plastic and cardboard. Then, he went to sleep. When he woke up, he collected the ashes and fragments of bones and scattered them along the border of the nearby forest. Gheorghe's account of what happened to Alexandra was even more sinister. On July 24th, 2 months after Louise's murder, he noticed the same girl hitchhiking on the road again. Even though he was driving in the opposite direction, he turned the car around and offered her a ride. The story repeated itself. He offered Alexandra 50 lei for intimate services, and upon her refusal, he abducted her. He brought the bound girl to his home, immediately tying her to the bed and subjecting her to violence. The next day at 6 in the morning, Gheorghe was drinking coffee while his victim lay tied to the bed. The girl complained of a terrible headache and said she needed a painkiller. Gheorghe suggested going to buy some medication. Before leaving, he additionally tied her with ropes, wires, and a chain. In addition to the medication, he bought a prepaid card to call Alexandra's mother. Inserting it into the girl's mobile phone, he called her mother and claimed to be Alexandra's boyfriend, assuring her that everything was fine. Then he discarded the phone. The phone was later found, and some children played with it. The man returned home around noon. He saw that Alexandra had freed herself and was wandering around the house with his mobile phone. He struck her several times, causing her to fall and hit her head on the concrete floor, resulting in her death. The man wrapped the body in bedsheets, placed some wooden planks and chips, and a 2-liter bottle of Vaseline in a barrel and set it on fire. On top, he threw a thick cardboard. He also threw his mobile phone there. Then he went to sleep. He woke up early in the morning to the barking of dogs, as police were banging on his door. Despite the man's confession and the results of the DNA analysis, the families of Alexandra and Louisa refused to believe that Gheorghe killed the girls. And the matter was not only in the reluctance of the relatives to believe that they are no longer alive. In fact, there was reason to suspect Gheorghe of human trafficking and that the girls weren't killed but were sold for exploitation. First of all, in favor of this version is the fact that human trafficking is a very common phenomenon in Romania. Additionally, in 2022, Gheorghe recanted his confession. He confirmed that he kidnapped and mistreated Alexandra and Louisa, but then handed them over to a local criminal boss who sent the girls to a brothel in Turkey. The police allegedly protect this boss, so they tortured Gheorghe and forced him to take the blame for the murder, and they planted Alexandra's teeth themselves. The man's story seems far-fetched if it weren't for some facts. It's unclear why George didn't immediately try to dispose of Alexandra's body, knowing that she had called the police from his phone. Instead of that, he slowly cremated her body for a long 8 hours. Moreover, the burning of an entire human body should produce a very unpleasant smell and smoke. However, the man's neighbors didn't notice any smoke, smell, or anything unusual. The way Gheorghe behaved during the abductions shows that he knew step by step how to act. He knew how to select victims of a specific appearance, and the act of abduction itself seemed standardized. The series of potential crimes was only interrupted when Alexandra pulled him out of this familiar routine by calling the police. Furthermore, investigators speculated that Gheorghe might have had accomplices. The point is, right after the girls' disappearances, unknown individuals called both families several times, assuring them that the girls were all right. At least 2 of these calls were made by Gheorghe, but Alexandra's mother and Louisa's grandfather are convinced that 2 people were calling them. This argument that Gheorghe might have had accomplices prompted not only Romanian police, but also the FBI, Eurojust, and Italy's main anti-mafia agency to get involved in the investigation. Additionally, it seemed to the relatives that the prosecution intentionally prolonged the case. In particular, the prosecutor received video material that indicated Gheorghe's car was connected to Louisa's abduction, but the prosecutor never summoned him for questioning or ordered a search of his car or home. After Alexandra's disappearance until July 27th, he didn't share the surveillance camera footage, which captured Gheorghe's car. Even then, he only showed them a single frame from the video where the car's license plate wasn't visible. Also, on July 27th, after searching the man's house, another accuser not only claimed that Alexandra was killed on that night, but also that strangulation was the cause of her death. However, how could he know this without the victim's body? Gheorghe hadn't made a confession yet. And finally, the most intriguing argument in favor of the possibility that the man might have been involved in human trafficking is that his daughter, Daniela Dinca, assured investigators and the media that she wanted nothing to do with her father and didn't communicate with him. But it turned out to be a lie. She did communicate with her father, and she has a criminal record herself. A few years ago, she was accused of connections to human trafficking networks. Following this, another revelation came in the story. Gheorghe Dinca's son, Dan, was once involved in a group assault and escaped punishment only due to his father's intervention. Allegedly, Gheorghe had connections within the police and the prosecutor's office. The victim was persuaded to withdraw her statement and the case was kept confidential. Equally important in this case is the question of whether Gheorghe's list of victims could be longer. 2 girls were abducted under similar circumstances when trying to hitchhike, and they resembled each other in appearance. This points to a characteristic modus operandi of the criminal, relying on chance and showing an interest in a specific type of appearance. The man's inclination to commit crimes might partly be explained by his suffering from antisocial personality disorder. This condition is characterized by a constant pursuit of pleasure and satisfaction, as well as a lack of empathy, respect for the feelings, needs, or suffering of others, and a lack of remorse after offending or causing harm to another person. Some individuals suffering from this condition cannot form close relationships and use dominance and intimidation to control others. In this context, all the elements of the puzzle come together to form a coherent picture.
But what's surprising is Gheorghe's age, 66 years old. Criminals with a similar diagnosis usually evolve into violent killers during their youth. This disorder remains with a person throughout their life and doesn't appear and then diminish like other mental disorders. In other words, it's rare for a man to suddenly kill 2 girls with a 2-month gap at the age of 66.
Gheorghe most likely committed other heinous crimes in the past. It's unlikely that Alexandra and Louise were his only victims. Very unlikely. Gheorghe was charged with human trafficking, trafficking of minors, 2 cases of assault, 2 murders, and 2 cases of desecration of bodies. But he wasn't planning on surrendering so easily. Dubbed the Caracal monster, he attempted to sue Romania in the European Court of Human Rights, pointing to a lack of evidence and claiming that he was treated unfairly during his arrest. He fought for a long time, but ultimately lost. On September 23rd, the 69-year-old Gheorghe was sentenced to the maximum possible punishment, 30 years of imprisonment. The thing is, for all the charges brought against him, he should have received 108 years in prison. But for individuals over the age of 65, the maximum punishment is considered to be 30 years. He is also obligated to pay compensation of 700,000 euros to the victim's relatives. The neighbor of the man, Stefan Repeziano, was sentenced to 7 years in prison for his involvement in the violence. In March 2023, Gheorghe once again caught the public's attention by declaring that he had repented and found God. He stated that he was able to forget and leave behind the entire ordeal. In contrast to him, the victim's relatives will never be able to forget what happened. Jose was not an ordinary guy, quite the opposite. He felt that he could get anything he wanted from life, not because he was capable or deserving of it, but simply because he desired it so much. He didn't like blending in with the crowd. He wanted to stand out, to make people tremble with fear at the sight of him. Jose was tough, just like his friends. They always had each other's backs, did everything together, and on that night when Jose saw a ring with the letter E engraved on it, he knew he had to have it because his girlfriend's name was Esther. He thought it would be a perfect romantic gesture. So he leaned over and took the ring off the lifeless girl's hand, a girl he and his friends had just killed. Jennifer Lee Ertman, who was 14 years old, and Elizabeth Christine Pena, who was 16, were best friends. Despite Jennifer being younger, she was obedient and well-mannered, and her positive influence had a wonderful impact on her friend Elizabeth. Elizabeth's parents were delighted that their daughter had such a reliable, faithful, and fantastic friend. The two girls shared an interest in makeup and fashion. They enjoyed dressing uniquely, skillfully applying makeup, and choosing accessories. They attended the same school in Houston, Texas, and were currently on summer vacation. Thursday, June 24, 1993 came around. A friend invited Elizabeth and Jennifer to a poolside party. At 4:45 p.m., Jennifer's father, Randy, dropped her off at Elizabeth's house, where at 8 p.m., Elizabeth's mother, Melissa, drove the girls to their friend Gina's house, who was hosting the party. The girls were excited and thrilled, enjoying the pleasant warm summer evening in the company of friends. Time flew by unnoticed, and the hour when their parents would expect them to be home was approaching. In principle, the parents weren't afraid to let the girls go out in the evening. They had cash with them just in case. Jennifer carried a pager and always kept $10 for a taxi in her pocket. And if they wanted their parents to pick them up, they only needed to find a telephone or a payphone and call. But this time, the girls decided to walk home. As they said their goodbyes to all their friends, the clock struck 10:45 and they were feeling the pressure of time. The girls had two options for walking home on foot. They could have taken the usual route by walking along the boulevard and turning onto the street leading to Elizabeth's house. This path would have taken them about half an hour. On the other hand, the park offered the possibility of saving 10 to 15 minutes. Despite their concerns about being late, they decided to go through the park. The route involved walking through the park, crossing a railway bridge, following a path, and eventually arriving at Elizabeth's house. Of course, at night, this route was dark and secluded, a place that teenage girls should avoid. However, many teenagers in the city casually used this shortcut. On the same night, Sandra Ertman woke up around 4 a.m. and noticed that the light in Jennifer's room was still on, which was unusual. Usually, when Jennifer came home, she would always turn off the light to let her parents know she had safely arrived and was going to sleep. Sandra assumed that Jennifer had stayed overnight at her friend Elizabeth's house without informing them. When her husband woke up a little later, he asked Sandra if their daughter had spent the night at Elizabeth's or Gina's house. Sandra replied that she wasn't sure. She wanted to cover for their daughter to avoid her father scolding her, but by 11 a.m., Sandra and Randy started calling Gina's and Elizabeth's families. The Pena family didn't answer the calls, presumably because they were at work. Around 1 p.m., Randy went to talk to Gina. She mentioned that she last saw the girls at 10:45 p.m. the previous night when they were heading to Elizabeth's house. Gina suggested that Randy should go together with her to the Pena family home. They did just that. Randy Ertman and Gina knocked on the door and even the windows of the house, calling out for Jennifer and Elizabeth, but received no response. Randy took Gina back home and returned to the Pena family's house. It was then that he finally met Adolfo and Melissa Pena. The parents of Elizabeth revealed that they hadn't seen the girls since the previous evening and assumed that their daughter was just sleeping in on her summer vacation, so they hadn't checked her room in the morning. They called the police, but initially, the authorities didn't take the disappearance of the girls seriously. In response, the families took matters into their own hands, printed flyers, went door to door asking neighbors if they had seen their daughters, but no one had any information. Adolfo came up with an idea to walk through the park since he knew about the short path to his house. He walked across the railway bridge and the path where the girls might have walked. Something urged him to check near the tree line, but fortunately, he didn't give in to that intuition. 4 days of uncertainty passed when a call came into the Crime Stoppers hotline. An anonymous caller reported that the girls were in the park. Officers immediately began the search. At the edge of the wooded area, an officer noticed something resembling an item of women's clothing. As he approached, he realized it was not just clothing but the bodies of the girls. The victims were lying on their backs just a few meters apart, naked, and their bodies had already greatly decomposed due to the summer heat. Insects were present, making it even more difficult for even experienced police officers to look at the bodies. Initially, they wanted to keep the horrifying find hidden from reporters and the public, but the news spread rapidly. Randy Ertman was speaking with journalists about his daughter's disappearance when a reporter informed him over the radio that the bodies had been found in the park. Randy persuaded the reporters to take him to the park. Police officers had to restrain him as he attempted to break through the police tape, shouting, "She has light hair. Tell me one of them has light hair." He only stepped back when a detective told him that he couldn't provide any information yet and needed Jennifer's dental records. It was then that Randy understood the officers were trying to shield him from the sight of the bodies, an image he would never be able to forget. Dental records confirmed that the bodies found in the park belonged to 14-year-old Jennifer Ertman and 16-year-old Elizabeth Pena. The cause of death was strangulation. Several shoe prints were discovered around the bodies, indicating that there were multiple perpetrators involved. Now, when the girls were found, the police were determined to find those responsible for their deaths. Although it was assumed that the call to Crime Stoppers could be entirely anonymous, the police traced it back. The call led them to the home of the Kent family. The homeowner, Joe Kent, admitted to making the call. He listed several names and claimed that these individuals were the ones who killed the girls. Among them was his own brother, Peter Kent. The police searched Peter's room and found jewelry belonging to the girls, which confirmed Joe's statement. But what exactly happened that night? So, Jennifer and Elizabeth decided to take a shortcut through the park because they had promised their parents to return before the designated time. It was around 11 o'clock, and the park was not a particularly safe place for two young girls at that time. Nevertheless, they walked through the park and encountered two young men. The guys' names were Frank and Roman Sandoval. They didn't say anything to the girls, didn't attempt to harass, shout, or whistle at them. They simply passed by. It would have been wonderful if they had told Jennifer and Elizabeth about the gang meeting taking place in the park and advised them to turn around and go in a different direction. That would have saved them. However, the brothers just walked past. Soon after, they heard a woman's scream. Did they realize what was happening? Yes, of course, they did. But they didn't do anything. They just left. The twin brothers, Frank and Roman, had just attended a ceremony for initiating a new gang member, which was held in the park. 6 young people aged between 14 and 18 took part in the ceremony. Essentially, they were all teenagers. The participants included 18-year-olds Jose Medin, Derek Sean O'Brien, and Peter Kentua, as well as 17-year-old Efren Perez and 14-year-old Venancio Medin, the younger brother of Jose. The new 17-year-old gang member whose initiation was taking place was named Raul the Ariel. So, besides the Sandoval brothers, the 6 teenagers gathered in the park to initiate the new gang member. The initiation was quite peculiar. Raul had to fight with each of the guys for 5 minutes. He didn't succeed entirely, but they accepted him nonetheless. After the formal part, if you can call it that, the guys stayed in the park, drinking and chatting. Suddenly, Frank Sandoval had an uneasy feeling and insisted that he and his brother leave. Following the twins, 18-year-old Jose Medin and his 14-year-old brother were about to leave when suddenly Jose noticed Elizabeth. He attempted to grab her chest, but she pushed his hand away and wanted to continue walking. However, this was not part of Jose's plans. He said, "No, little girl, where do you think you're going?" and put his hand around her neck, dragging her down the small slope. Jennifer was walking slightly ahead and had already passed the spot where the gang's initiation was taking place. She had every chance to escape and save herself, but upon hearing Elizabeth's cries, she rushed to help her. Not many would have intervened in such a situation, but Jennifer acted exactly like that. She saw only Jose and thought that she and Elizabeth could handle one guy together, giving her a real chance to save her friend. She probably didn't suspect that there were 5 more teenagers down the slope. So when Jennifer rushed back to Elizabeth, other members of the gang grabbed her and knocked her to the ground. The guys forced the girls to take off their clothes and underwear, and for the next hour 5 guys in turn, and sometimes at the same time, mocked Jennifer and Elizabeth. 14-year-old Venancio Medai and watched in amazement. Later, he will tell how the girls fought off their attackers. Jennifer bit the assailants, while Elizabeth kicked the air and screamed. They were, of course, weaker than the 6 teenagers, the boys, but they still did everything they could to escape. During the attack, the victims often looked at each other, which made them cry even harder. At first, Elizabeth didn't cry, she was more in anger. However, seeing what the boys were doing to Jennifer, tears started streaming down her cheeks as well. The boys approvingly patted each other on the back when they switched places and crudely insulted the girls. Even Jose dared to ask Elizabeth for her name and phone number while mocking her. 14-year-old Venancio Medin watched the attack in horror. When he asked to hang out with his older brother, he probably didn't expect anything like this. He also didn't want to participate in the relentless abuse, but he feared the other boys. So, after their instructions, he also mistreated Jennifer. It is reported that he was the only one who asked his brother and Peter Kent to release the girls, but Peter whispered to him that they saw their faces and could identify them. The leader of the group, 18-year-old Peter Kent, declared that they must not allow the victims to be identified later. The newcomer, Raoul, yelled at Jennifer, ordering her to kneel. He and Sean O'Brien began choking Jennifer with Sean's red shoelaces. But they tore apart, and they had to finish what they started with the girls' shoelaces. Elizabeth, who was forced to witness Jennifer's murder, pleaded with the boys to spare her, offering to give them her phone number so they could meet up and hang out if they let her go. She did and said everything she could to save her life. However, it didn't work, and Elizabeth made one last desperate attempt to escape. Unfortunately, she was intercepted. Peter Cantu always boasted about his steel-toed boots. It was with those boots that he attacked the girl, breaking her ribs and knocking out several teeth. Then, Peter, Jose, and Efren strangled Elizabeth with shoelaces. At that moment, they noticed Jennifer was still alive, and they started stomping on the victims' bodies and necks to ensure their demise. It was a monstrous murder of the girls, who simply wanted to take a shortcut so their parents wouldn't scold them. Without a shred of remorse, the killers divided the spoils, the few pieces of jewelry that belonged to Jennifer and Elizabeth. They even took the watch with Goofy, a Disney character that Jennifer liked. On the first ring was engraved the letter E, and Jose took the ring to give it to his girlfriend, Esther. After committing the crime, several boys went to Peter's place, where his brother Joe and his 16-year-old wife, Christina, were present. Christina noticed that they were covered in blood, disheveled, as if they had just been in a fight. They threw the bloodied items at her and ordered her to get rid of them. Christina asked what had happened, and Jose replied that they had just had some fun. Then they began relishing the details of what they had done, showing enthusiasm and boasting, without any sign of remorse. It disgusted Christina and Joe to hear this, but they pretended that everything was normal and silently listened. Christina herself had been a victim of violence in the past, and the actions of the gang deeply affected her. When the boys left, she told her husband that he should call the police anonymously. Joe was hesitant because it wasn't just about his brother but also about the other gang members who could seek revenge against him. However, Christina couldn't bear the thought of the girls lying in the park without their families having a proper chance to say goodbye to them. She convinced Joe to make an anonymous call to Crime Stoppers, ensuring that nobody would know it was him. The next day, Joe made the call in a hushed tone, informing the police where to find the bodies. Initially, the police didn't find anything, but after 4 days, a persistent officer eventually discovered the crime scene. Undoubtedly, Christina and Joe were very scared when the police traced the anonymous call, but they had made the right decision in doing so. On June 29, 1993, all 6 members of the gang were arrested. The red nail polish belt they used to try to strangle Jennifer was found in O'Brien's apartment. During the interrogations, the friendship between the boys came to an abrupt end. Each of them claimed to have been in the park, but others were the ones who killed the girls. The police pieced together the full picture of how events unfolded that night. Nearly all the details about what happened were known thanks to the testimony of 14-year-old Venanzio Medellin. The boys were tried separately, so the families had to listen to the horrifying details of their daughter's murders 5 times. Venanzio Medellin was the exception. He made a deal and was sentenced to 40 years in prison. The other 5 were sentenced to the death penalty. In the cases of Jose Medellin, Derek O'Brien, and Peter Cantu, the sentences were carried out. Sean O'Brien and Jose Medellin found the courage to apologize to the victims' families, but Peter Cantu didn't even do that. Adolfo and Melissa Pena believe it doesn't matter, as he wouldn't say anything that would change anything. The sentences of Efren and Raul were changed to life imprisonment because they were 17 at the time of the crime, and the Supreme Court prohibited the execution of individuals who were younger than 18 when they committed the crime. The court proceedings were extremely difficult, not only because the victims' families had to listen to their daughters' torture 5 times, but also because the criminals' relatives accused Jennifer and Elizabeth's parents of allowing them to go to the park, even though their own relatives were drinking and fighting there too. Efren's stepfather approached Elizabeth's father and said in Spanish, "This is your fault for not raising your daughter properly." The most horrifying aspect of this story is that it wasn't the gang's first crime. Sean O'Brien, Peter Cantu, and Jose Medellin had already murdered a young mother, 27-year-old Patricia Lopez. She was waiting at a gas station for her husband to pick her up after her car broke down. The killers dragged her into the park, where they assaulted and strangled her with Sean O'Brien's red nail polish belt. O'Brien's fingerprints were found at the crime scene, and all of this happened 6 months before Jennifer and Elizabeth's murder. However, he was not charged for it. In addition to that, the criminals attacked random pedestrians on the street at least twice, including an armed robbery of another teenager and the murder of a completely unknown man. Despite the horror of the case, it had some positive consequences. Jennifer and Elizabeth's parents showed the world what it means to be a victim but not a helpless one. When the judge asked the parents if they wanted to address Peter Cantu, Randy Ertman immediately stood up and expressed everything he needed to say to Peter. Many criticized the judge for allowing Randy to yell at Peter. However, thanks to this, now after the sentencing, the victims' families have the right to address the perpetrator. They can also be present during the execution, which was previously prohibited. The families of Elizabeth and Jennifer visited the executions of the 3 killers. The families continue to fight for justice to this day. All 6 convicts appealed their sentences. Venanzio was denied parole 5 times, and each time the families met with the judges to prevent his release. Randy said, "I want this man to sit in jail for the rest of his life. I want this piece of crap to die in jail, and I will do everything in my power to keep him in jail. Do you want him as your neighbor? Do you want him living next to you?" Jennifer and Elizabeth had no choice. He had a choice. He could have walked away, but he didn't. Unfortunately, after his daughter's murder, Randy tried to find solace at the bottom of a bottle. But after 5 years, he pulled himself together, quit drinking, and started the path of healing. He and his wife moved away because everything in their hometown reminded them of their daughter. In 2014, at the age of 61, Randy Ertman passed away from lung cancer. Jennifer was his only daughter, and he fought not only for her but for the other victims as well. Thanks to him, other victims' families now have more rights and opportunities. On March 5, 2018, the medical staff at a hospital in San Diego, California, was awaiting the arrival of a 28-year-old patient named Brigida. She was being transported by an ambulance from her family doctor's office. On that day, Brigida called her mother, Olga, complaining of feeling unwell. Olga struggled to get her into the car. Brigida could barely breathe, and her legs trembled with excruciating pain. With just one look at the once vibrant and healthy young woman, The family doctor knew that Brigida was in critical condition and there was nothing he could do for her. Therefore, he called an ambulance to take her to the clinic. The emergency department medics were also alarmed that they might not be able to stabilize the patient's condition. Brigida was in unbearable pain, could hardly see anything, could barely speak, and had no sensation in her feet or hands. But the most puzzling symptom was that her once beautiful chestnut hair was falling out in clumps. The doctors began their work. They quickly determined that there were no external signs of trauma on her body. No bruises, wounds, or indications of infection. The cause of her illness was internal. Brigida's mother explained that her daughter had been suffering from sudden episodes of nausea, fatigue, and excruciating pain for several months. The symptoms would occur suddenly without any warning, causing her to spend days in bed. Brigida could barely take care of herself, let alone her husband and young son. Various specialists she consulted were at a loss, unable to understand what was afflicting her. Her symptoms did not match any known illness. One doctor even told her that her case was how critical days manifest. Finally, the doctors concluded that it was a result of stress and prescribed her tranquilizers. However, her condition worsened, her body was failing, and the medical staff in the emergency department of San Diego understood that if they didn't figure out what was wrong with her as soon as possible, the patient could die within days. Brigida grew up in California, just a few kilometers away from the border with Mexico. Her father worked at the customs between Mexico and the United States, while her mother took care of their two daughters, Brigida and her younger sister Olga. The girls grew up in a loving and caring family. Brigida happily attended a Catholic school, excelling in her studies. Her friends described her as the friendliest and kindest girl they knew. Brigida had a passion for running and even participated in competitions representing her school. It was through running that she met her future husband, Race Remington Uto. They met in high school. Race attended a different school but was also passionate about sports. At first, Brigida's family didn't pay much attention to their friendship because their daughter wasn't interested in dating boys. Her time was consumed by studying and sports. However, gradually, the young couple became more and more involved with each other and started dating. Race managed to bring out a more adventurous side of Brigida, and soon they became inseparable. Race had a highly ambitious goal. He dreamt of attending the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis. The acceptance rate for students was less than 8%, making it a challenging task. The applicant had to excel in school, work on personal development, engage in sports, participate in community life, engage in volunteer work, and much more. Surprisingly, Race managed to gain admission to the academy, and he moved to Maryland to begin his education. The young couple continued their relationship long distance. However, after some time, Race was diagnosed with a hernia that didn't resolve completely. He had to leave the academy but found work as an electrician in the Navy. Meanwhile, Brigida pursued her own plans and became a teacher. In 2014, after 7 years of being together, 25-year-old Brigida and 24-year-old Race got married. Soon after, they welcomed their son. Brigida believed she was perfectly happy with everything in her life going according to plan. She had a loving, caring husband, a wonderful child, and lived just steps away from her parents. However, her life would soon take an extraordinary and painful turn that she could never have imagined. Among the emergency department physicians at San Diego Hospital, there was a certified toxicologist named Dr. Jeff Lapointe, which was considered rare. He was a true medical detective, and like an excellent detective, Lapointe followed the trail of clues that could lead him to understand what was happening to Brigida. Was she being killed by an autoimmune disease? No, blood tests did not confirm that. Could she be suffering from cancer? No, although one symptom stood out among all others. Hair loss was not due to the disease but rather a result of therapy. All the symptoms indicated that Brigid had been exposed to a toxic chemical. But which one and how? Was it arsenic, cadmium, or cesium? No, because these heavy metals wouldn't result in hair loss. However, there was one substance that could: thallium. In the early 20th century, thallium was used as a depilatory agent. It was also actively utilized by doctors. For example, if a child had head lice, thallium was applied to their head, causing the lice to fall off along with all the hair. In subsequent years, thallium became the main component of rodent poisons. However, by the 1970s, its popularity as a murder weapon, alongside arsenic, had increased to the point where it was banned for sale and use. All of Brigid's symptoms, including leg pain, weakness, deteriorating vision, loss of appetite, weight loss, and, of course, hair loss, indicated thallium poisoning. The problem was that Dr. Lapointe couldn't confirm his suspicions quickly. Nobody in the hospital had encountered such a case before, and there was no way to test the patient for poisoning. The samples had to be sent to another laboratory, and the results would be available in 3 days. 3 days that Brigid might not have. The race against time had begun. Lapointe started calling all the agencies, requesting an expedited analysis. But even if the doctor's suspicions proved to be correct and Brigid was suffering from thallium poisoning, the antidote would be urgently needed. However, obtaining the antidote, poetically named Berlin Blue, turned out to be more challenging than he could ever imagine. We have all seen Berlin Blue because it is a blue pigment used in paints. Vincent van Gogh used it when painting Starry Night over the Rhone. This substance is also an antidote for poisoning by certain heavy metals, accelerating their elimination from the body. However, while you can buy blue paint at the nearest art supply store, obtaining medical-grade Berlin Blue is almost unrealistic. Lapointe called all the pharmacies, naval medical officers, clinics, but he found the antidote only at one warehouse, a classified warehouse in Los Angeles. The thing is, Berlin Blue is also an antidote for radiation exposure, such as in the case of a dirty bomb explosion. Therefore, the government keeps meticulous records of every tube of Berlin Blue in the country. And Dr. Lapointe couldn't count on getting the antidote until thallium poisoning was confirmed in the laboratory. When the toxicological analysis of Brigid's case arrived, Lapointe's worst fears were confirmed. The level of thallium in Brigid's body exceeded the permissible limit by 1,000 times. A hospital staff member drove all night to bring the antidote to San Diego. However, the doctor feared that with such a severe poisoning, one antidote might not be sufficient. He prescribed dialysis for the patient to cleanse her blood. It was a slow and painful process, and now all the medical staff and Brigid's family could do was wait and pray. Meanwhile, Brigid's husband and son were placed in another wing of the hospital to monitor their health. If she had been exposed to thallium, they could have been affected too. The main question remained, where could she have obtained such a large quantity of thallium? And the answer to that was being sought by FBI agents. It should be understood that all this was happening in a state with several military bases. Furthermore, these events unfolded against the backdrop of President Trump's planned visit. Therefore, when Dr. Lapointe started looking for Berlin Blue, the FBI agents became very interested in what was happening in the city. FBI agents and police have discovered that several months ago, Brigid underwent treatment at an alternative medicine clinic in Mexico when she began experiencing an unexplained illness. The police investigated this lead but ultimately dismissed it. The school where Brigid taught was a former military base during World War II, where rodent poisoning could have occurred in the past. In that year, many teachers at the school fell ill. However, this lead also turned out to be a dead end. Investigators could not dismiss the possibility that Brigid had used thallium herself as a cry for attention due to her depression. But everyone who knew her claimed that she loved life and would never abandon her son. Furthermore, her depression emerged after the appearance of unexplained symptoms, not the other way around. Dr. Lapointe had his own suspicions about how his patient had been poisoned. He conducted a scan of Brigide's internal organs and was horrified to discover numerous white spots throughout her digestive tract. It became evident that the poison was entering her body through food. Someone close to her had attempted the perfect crime. Dr. Lapointe ordered complete isolation for the patient, allowing no one to visit her or provide her with food except what was provided by the hospital. However, at that moment, food was the least of her concerns. Brigide regained consciousness thanks to the antidote after a few days. All her hair had fallen out, and she couldn't sit or move, but she was alive. She couldn't name anyone who would wish her harm. However, the police knew that poisoning is always a personal crime committed by a close friend or family member. It was also interesting that Brigide's husband and child were unharmed. The police spoke with her sister, parents, and husband, all of whom were eager to help with the investigation. Ray wept and lamented that he couldn't switch places with his wife to relieve her suffering. He said what the detectives wanted to hear, yet investigators sensed falsehood in his words. The medical staff also noted that he didn't seem as concerned and asked strange and sometimes inappropriate questions. Response to the suspicion regarding her husband's involvement, Brigide became angered and vehemently denied it. She insisted that Ray had been caring for her when she was unwell, taking care of their son and bringing her to the hospital. Furthermore, he would prepare meals when she lacked the strength to get out of bed. However, during the conversation with Brigide, the investigators learned something that sent chills down their spines. Ray had a rather unusual hobby. He enjoyed collecting rare seeds of poisonous plants. This piqued the police's interest, and after 16 days of Brigide's hospitalization, the police gathered enough evidence to search their home. Ray opened the door and appeared somewhat agitated. The detectives asked him to hand over all the family's gadgets, and he willingly surrendered all the phones and laptops. However, he couldn't help but notice that all the search histories on the devices had recently been cleared. Despite the supposedly deleted data on his phone, the police found 2 books in Ray's mobile, Criminal Poisoning and The Poisoner's Handbook. According to the Poisoner's Handbook, thallium gives the poisoner the ability to control how quickly their victim dies. The poisoning presents itself as a medical enigma, with the patient slowly deteriorating for unknown reasons. There were even more intriguing discoveries. In Ray's car, they found a canister of acetone and a packet of exotic seeds hidden in a small compartment in the spare tire. Additionally, Brigide's sister handed over a black garbage bag that she retrieved from the trash bin, as their mother noticed Ray throwing it away just before the police arrived. Inside were receipts for exotic seeds such as tick seed, crea nut, and Cerbera odolum, along with various tools for their filtration and grinding. In other words, everything necessary for the production of rare poisons. It was evident that the man had already attempted to crush tick seeds to obtain ricin, a poison toxic to mice but dangerous to humans if inhaled or ingested. The detectives' suspicions grew, but there were no traces of thallium found in the house, garage, or car. Therefore, there was no basis for arresting Ray. All they could do was share their suspicions with Brigide and ask her not to return home. She still couldn't believe their words, but she didn't object to the continuation of the investigation. The investigators continued to dig deeper and discover the possible motive for the murder. Ray had a lover who believed he was a widower. He lied to her, claiming to be a Navy SEAL and expressing his goal to work for the FBI in the poisoning division. He didn't hesitate to bring his young son on their dates, and the boy had grown so attached to the woman that he called her mom. Leading a double life, Ray went even further and started another affair, confessing to the woman that he was married. However, he hoped that his wife would be hit by a bus, so he wouldn't have to share custody of their son. It's unclear why this didn't alarm the woman. Nonetheless, it was clear that the man wanted to end his relationship with Brigide. But as a devout Catholic, she had warned him before their marriage that she did not believe in divorce and that if they married, it would be for life. She could hardly have expected her unfaithful husband to take this ending so literally. The detectives asked Ray to undergo a polygraph test, which he failed miserably. When the polygraph examiner informed him of the results, he didn't attempt to deny it and confessed to everything. Race stated that he ordered thallium online 3 times. In August 2017, he first attempted to add it to his wife's food by preparing her a sandwich for breakfast. He calculated the amount of thallium based on her weight. The next day, Brigida felt unwell, but it didn't kill her. She started to recover. In December of the same year, Race added a slightly larger amount of thallium to the soup. Again, he didn't achieve the desired effect. In January, he increased the dosage 5-fold and once again hid the poison in a sandwich. He intended to kill Brigida within days. She felt terrible, experienced excruciating pain, and began losing her hair, but she continued to fight for her life. After confessing, Race was arrested. 8 months later, he pleaded guilty to 3 attempts to murder his wife. His lawyer tried to argue that Race suffered a spinal injury while serving in the Navy, and the pain clouded his judgment. However, this defense did not help. On March 14, 2019, he was sentenced to 3 life imprisonments ranging from 21 years to life. He may be eligible for parole in October 2033. If he is lucky and succeeds in his first attempt at freedom, he will serve only 14 years in prison and become a free man before his 42nd birthday. During the trial, Brigida was finally able to address her husband personally. She said, "I wanted to believe that I knew the man I married 3 years ago, the man I had been dating for nearly 10 years. I wanted to believe that he would never harm me. I am horrified by the thought that he could be responsible for attempting to kill me. How could you do this to the mother of your child? Why do you think you have the right to decide that I am not a worthy mother for your son? How could you decide that the way to end our marriage is by slowly killing your wife, watching her suffer for months? I cared for you and I loved you." Every time Brigida recalls the incident, she breaks into a cold sweat. She felt unwell and was lying in bed. Her husband brought her a sandwich with peanut butter. Their little son climbed onto the bed and asked for a bit. Race immediately shouted at her not to give him any. Brigida doesn't know if there was thallium in that sandwich, but she believes her son was at least on the brink of severe poisoning. Despite Brigida's reluctance to admit divorce, she eventually divorced Race. She still suffers from constant fatigue, weakness in her legs, and nerve damage. However, she is gradually recovering and has returned to work at a school for children with special needs. She admits that now it is much easier for her to find an approach to each student. Brigida, who once couldn't walk, is now running again, trying skydiving, and striving to live life to the fullest. Poria Mumnai and Cassandre Bouvier became friends in Paris while studying at the Sorbonne. The girls were passionate about the cultures of other countries, especially Latin America, so they studied the history, social and political movements, and culture of the region. Poria, who was born in Morocco, was 24 years old. After completing her thesis on Argentina, she decided to put aside her books and visit the country she had written about. Cassandra, at the age of 29, was no stranger to traveling the world, so she gladly accepted her friend's invitation. The girls packed their suitcases and embarked on a journey through the countries of South America, Central America, and the Caribbean basin. In July 2011, the friends arrived in Salta. It is a province located in the northwest of Argentina with a very interesting geographical, social, and historical repertoire. The landscapes ranged from snow-capped peaks in the Western Plains with a tropical dry climate in the east. The architecture includes churches and cathedrals built during the colonial period, ideal for exploration and study by curious students. However, it is worth noting that, like many provinces in the north of the country and probably throughout Latin America, Salta maintains conservative customs. The influence of the Catholic Church on people's daily lives is significant, and the differences between social classes are pronounced. Politics is controlled by a few influential families who have held power for decades. It is important to mention that as this story unfolds, things will become clearer shortly. On July 15th, Cassandra and Horia checked into a hotel in Salta and set out to explore the sites without unpacking their belongings, as they planned to return to Buenos Aires. Salta is a popular province among tourists, known for its low crime rate and friendly population, especially towards tourists. The main attraction in Salta is the natural reserve called Quebrada de San Lorenzo. At exactly 16:23 on July 15th, the girls purchased tickets to visit the reserve. They decided not to hire a guide and ventured deep into the forest. From Buenos Aires, they were supposed to contact their families and inform them of the next city they planned to visit. However, no word was heard from them. On the 19th, unable to bear the uncertainty, their families reached out to Cassandra and Horia's acquaintances in Argentina and asked them to contact the police. 2 weeks later, a group of tourists from a neighboring town embarked on the same trail as the French girls. They arrived at the reserve quite late in the evening, but it was not unusual in this area. Around 1800 hours, one of the tourists separated from the group to find a secluded spot in the dense undergrowth. There, he noticed something resembling a body. Approaching and confirming that it was indeed a body, he screamed and rushed back to the group to inform them of his discovery. The police arrived at the reserve around 10 p.m. The tourists had not marked the exact location where they found the body, only mentioning that it was near a viewpoint. Therefore, in the darkness and amidst the dense vegetation, the police initially struggled to locate it. Eventually, they found the body, but before they could begin their work, they discovered 2 more victims just a few meters away. It turned out to be the 2 missing French tourists. The police developed several theories, including the possibility that the girls were accidentally shot by a local hunter, as many residents in the area hunt for food. Therefore, the search focused on local residents. The police arrested Francisco Tejeda, who worked as a horseback riding guide for tourists. However, he was released just a few days later as there was no evidence connecting him to the crime. His wife told the press that her husband was arrested solely because they were poor people. The police needed a scapegoat to appease public opinion. Immediately after the discovery of the bodies, the police shared with the press that they had been lying in the forest for about 3 days. Since the girls had kept their tickets to the reserve for the 15th, various theories arose about what could have happened to them during the remaining days when they were reported missing. It was speculated that they might have been kidnapped, held captive somewhere, and then disposed of. However, the police later clarified that the girls were killed 14 days prior, and they had been lying in the reserve near the viewpoint all that time. Due to Cassandra's torn clothing and Uria's pants and underwear being pulled down to her knees, speculations about violence against the girls emerged. The autopsy confirmed this. The tourists were severely beaten, sexually assaulted, and then shot with a .22 caliber firearm. In the reserve, the police found a corresponding shell casing. They concluded that the girls had managed to take a walk and returned to the entrance of the reserve. There were few visitors at that time, the sun was setting, and the weather was not conducive to late walks. Obviously, it was then that the perpetrator or perpetrators approached their victims, with one attacker assaulting Cassandra. After the violence inflicted upon her, the girl was shot in the head while kneeling before her killer. Uria, who witnessed Cassandra's murder, decided not to give up too easily. A clump of hair remained in her clenched fist, indicating her struggle with at least one assailant. Then, according to investigators' assumptions, the girl dashed down the slope from the height when she was caught by a bullet. It hit her in the back, passing through her shoulder. The culprits left, believing that Uria was also finished. However, she was still alive and attempted to crawl back to the trail. Nevertheless, her attempts were unsuccessful as she was too weak and endured several more hours of agony before succumbing to blood loss. The investigators examined the girls' hotel room and found only one phone among their belongings, instead of the expected 2. By determining the location of Uria's phone, they discovered that a local girl named Maria Fernanda Canizares, the daughter of a former police officer, was using it. They also found Uria's camera in her possession. The girl claimed that these were gifts from her boyfriend, Gustavo Lossi. Gustavo, 23 years old, worked as a guide in the reserve, and his father sold tickets to tourists. It was Gustavo who had offered his services to the French girls, but they declined. Gustavo had changed the SIM card in the phone, thinking that would be enough to avoid detection. Not immediately, but Gustavo Lossi confessed to being present at the crime scene and participating in the violence. However, he claimed that he was not the instigator or the killer of the French girls, but merely a witness. He recounted that upon hearing noise and running to the screens, he witnessed two men, 24-year-old Daniel Vilt, a stonemason, and 31-year-old Santos Clemente Vera, a gardener from the San Lorenzo plain, tormenting the girls. Supposedly, these men coerced him into participating in the violence and then allowed him to leave. However, he didn't forget to take the girl's phone and camera with him. However, during a search of Gustavo's home, the police discovered the weapon that fired the fatal shots. Uria's camera helped the police establish the exact time of the attack on the French girls. The girls were enjoying sightseeing and took several photos just before embarking on a hike through the reserve. 2 hours and 5 minutes later, at 6:28 p.m., the tourists took their last photo, which turned out blurry and unclear, allowing investigators to speculate that the attack occurred precisely at that moment. All three men were charged with murder. Witnesses immediately came forward, pointing to Vilt as the person who attempted to sell a rifle. However, he had a solid alibi as he was at a bank during the time of the attack and could prove it. In 2014, Gustavo Lossi was sentenced for 30 years in prison, while Vera was released due to insufficient evidence and his denial of guilt. He also claimed to have an alibi. However, the prosecutor demanded a review of the case, and in 2016, both men were sentenced to life imprisonment. It seemed that one of the most high-profile cases in Argentine history had reached its conclusion. But no, the story doesn't end there. French journalist Jean-Charles Chattard dedicated 4 years to his own investigation of this case and wrote a book presenting his arguments as to why the girls couldn't have been killed in the nature reserve on July 15, as the investigators claim. The journalist is convinced that the girls didn't die in the reserve, their bodies were simply brought there after the murder. Firstly, even after a short walk in the reserve, his shoes were covered in dust and dirt, unlike the victim's shoes. The girls couldn't have taken such a path, then endured violence, fought for their lives, and still had clean shoes. Secondly, the appearance of the tourists, in general, was strange. Their clothing was more suited for an evening event in the city rather than a hike in the nature reserve. The next strange thing is that the bodies lay in Quebrada de San Lorenzo for 2 weeks. The reserve is a wild, open area inhabited by pumas, foxes, and condors. After such a period, the police could have found completely gnawed bones. However, the bodies were discovered without a single bite mark, not to mention that they were lying in a popular reserve near a frequently visited viewpoint. Finally, the pathologist who examined the bodies confidently stated that they were killed 3 to a maximum of 5 days before the autopsy. Regarding the date of the murders, the doctor is categorical and indicated in the report that it was July 26, 2011. Remarkably, the judge who led the investigation changed this date to July 15th. Could it be possible that the judge intentionally manipulated the facts to protect someone? Could the judge intentionally tamper with evidence? Was he trying to protect someone? This is exactly what Nestor Piccolo, the commissioner in charge of the investigation, was convinced of, and it may have cost him his life. Commissioner Piccolo died under mysterious circumstances 4 months after the start of the investigation. He was found at the entrance of the commissioner's office with a bullet in his head. His mother stated that it was her son's decision, but she is certain that he was killed, and it was an execution. No traces of gunpowder were found on Nestor's hands, and before his death, he was working on a new version. According to Clemente Vera, he is innocent, and Gustavo Lossi is simply an accomplice of the real criminals, representatives of the upper classes of the province. Nicholas's investigation worried many people who wanted to hide the truth, including the judge. And the influential local families could not allow the light to be shed on the deaths of the French girls. However, this conspiracy of silence was interrupted in April 2014 by an anonymous letter describing the same trail that Commissioner Piccolo was investigating. The letter was sent to the victims' families in France. Chattard received a copy of it and pursued this lead. The anonymous letter was handwritten by a woman who chose not to sign it out of fear of testifying in court. Chattard spent several months, but eventually found a witness. It turned out to be a girl who is often in the company of a small circle of influential individuals in Salta. She knew that on July 15, 2011, the two tourists couldn't have been killed in the nature reserve because they were invited to a party organized by the city's wealthy youth. She paints a completely different picture of what happened. At such parties, alcohol flows freely and everything resembles a movie, but it's all happening in real life. According to the girl, Cassandra and Uriah were among the guests and were seen near the pool. As the evening progressed and more drinks were consumed, the men became increasingly interested in the attractive French women. Around 3 a.m., they led them inside the house, and no one saw them after that. The guys started harassing one of the tourists. Of course, she refused, but her opinion no longer mattered to the men, and things went too far. Her friend witnessed what happened, so the guys decided to kill both of them to prevent the truth from being revealed. However, they didn't rush. They tortured the victims for several days before finally killing them. The witness provided the exact location where this supposedly happened, a villa in the most fashionable district of the city, Buena Vista, where deputies, ministers, and wealthy foreigners reside. The villa is usually not occupied permanently as it is often rented out for private parties. There is also a pool, which is where the French women were last seen. But the most intriguing part is the villa's location, right beneath where the bodies were found. Behind the house, there is a hidden path leading to the lookout point of the nature reserve. If everything happened as the witness claims, the bodies of the girls were carried under the cover of night, taken through that path, and left in the dense undergrowth of the reserve. However, how could such a wild scenario, unfolding at a party in plain sight, remain a secret for so long? The witness claims that it can be explained by the terror imposed by the real criminals on anyone who dares to speak up. According to her, the party was organized by the son of a deputy who attacked the French woman. When she tried to escape, he severely beat her. 2 other sons of the politician were also involved in the assault and later in the murder. Today, the deputy's face calmly looks down from numerous billboards during his latest election campaign. By the way, one of his sons followed in his father's footsteps and became a politician as well. The politician refused to comment on these allegations, but one judge who presided over the initial investigation showed a great interest in the story described in the anonymous letter. He believes that it contains everything necessary to achieve justice. However, the judge who took over the case afterward had no intention of seeking other culprits. He believes that the family must be very influential to manipulate the police, and he attributes the deaths of the French women to the provincial justice system. The new version gives more weight to the witness's story, according to which he saw the 2 French women leaving the nature reserve on July 15. This means that the crime could have occurred in a different place and at a different time than what the investigators insist on. As for the blurred photographs supposedly taken during the attack in the nature reserve, Cassandra's father, Jean-Michel Bouvier, submitted the photo to an expert who believes that it has been manipulated using a photo editing program. The angle of the shot and the lighting cannot be as depicted in the photograph. In France, the victims' families no longer expect anything from the justice system. Jean-Michel Bouvier conducted an independent DNA analysis on his daughter's body. DNA from Gustavo Lossi and 2 other male individuals, as well as 1 female DNA, were found on the most intimate parts. There was no trace of Clemente Vera's sample. The ownership of the other samples remains unknown, raising questions about the identities of the other individuals involved in the attack on the girls and the true role of Gustavo Lossi. Meanwhile, in the heart of San Lorenzo, a few hundred meters from the place where Cassandra and Uriah's bodies were found, there still stands the modest home of Clemente Vera's parents. After their son's arrest, they struggle to make ends meet as they are unable to work the land or care for animals in their advanced age. Clemente's parents, his wife, and many local residents believe in his innocence. They believe that his only fault is living close to the crime scene and not having the means to afford lawyers. It is especially sad considering that nothing in the case files connects him to the crime. He claims that the police beat him, that threatened him and his child, demanding a confession to the murder. When he refused to comply, they ransacked his house in search of any incriminating evidence, but they were unsuccessful. In connection with this, in 2017, Santos Clemente Vera filed a complaint with the Supreme Court of Argentina, and in June 2020, he was granted permission for a case review. He hopes that a new trial will be conducted, during which he will be acquitted. Interestingly, Cassandra's father is convinced of his innocence. He witnessed all the hearings, traveled to Argentina multiple times to learn the details of the case, and conducted his own investigation, concluding that Vera did not commit the crime. Therefore, he visited Vera in prison, apologized to him, and then started a social media campaign for his release. Bouvier is concerned that the case review is taking an endlessly long time, while an innocent person continues to sit in prison in Salta. On November 25, 2013, on the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, a monument was solemnly unveiled in memory of Cassandra and Uriah. Alfredo Garzon, a sculptor from Salta who lived in Paris, responded to Jean-Michel Bouvier's request to take on this work. By depicting an outstretched hand, eyes, and the face with an anguished expression, Alfredo managed to create a very powerful image conveying the pain, horror, and suffering that the girls went through. The sculpture is located in the San Lorenzo ravine, where the victims' bodies were found. On the evening of Friday, April 20, 2012, the Celis family had a very pleasant time. Rebecca and Sergio's two sons played a baseball game in which their 6-year-old sister, young Isabelle, was present. The game lasted until 10 o'clock, after which the family returned home. The next morning, the girl was supposed to play baseball and Rebecca braided her hair so as not to waste time before work. At 11 o'clock, Sergio wished his daughter good night and left. Although Isabelle had her own bedroom, she often slept in her brother's room. But on this particular night, she stayed alone. Soon, Becky and the boys went to sleep, and Sergio fell asleep on the couch, watching a baseball game he had recorded earlier. At 5 o'clock, the man woke up and slowly made his way to the bedroom. The house was quiet and peaceful when he went to sleep next to his wife. 2 hours later, Rebecca left for work at the medical center. The woman didn't notice anything strange in the house and didn't hear anything. She didn't go into her daughter's room before leaving for work. At around 8 o'clock in the morning, Sergio went to wake his daughter up to go to the game, but Isabelle was not in her bed. He asked his sons if they had seen their sister, but nobody responded. Together with the boys, he searched the house and called for Isabelle, but there was no answer. Then, Sergio Jr., who was 14 years old at the time, noticed that the window in his sister's room was wide open and the protective screen was lying on the ground in the yard. The husband called his wife. While Rebecca was racing home and the sons were frantically searching the neighborhood for their younger sister, Sergio called the rescue service. This was the call that later sparked a lot of controversy and criticism towards him. People react differently in a state of stress or panic, but Sergio was surprisingly calm and collected during the call. Besides his calmness, it seemed strange to many that he immediately stated that his daughter had been kidnapped. He even laughed when he mentioned telling his wife to come home. Later, Sergio explained that he was simply trying to remain calm to provide the police with all the information they needed. Interestingly, the neighbor also called 911 on behalf of Sergio Jr. Unlike his father, he was shaking and clearly upset, but he also immediately stated that his sister had been kidnapped and they wouldn't find her. Then the phone was handed over to Rebecca, who had also been in a panic and despair when she arrived home. She was able to give a precise description of the clothing that her daughter was wearing before her disappearance. The arriving officers indeed found a protective screen on the bedroom window of the girl on the ground in the yard. There was a large hole in it, as if someone had used a tool to make it. Soft toys were always lying under the girl's window in the room, and now they were scattered in disorder. Blood was discovered on the floor next to Isabelle. Shoe prints were found behind the house, on the alley and on the electrical box under the high fence of the family. Presumably, the perpetrator climbed over it when he abducted the girl. The police organized massive searches, going from door to door, believing it was a kidnapping case, rejecting the idea that the 6-year-old girl could have run away. The neighbor of the Celis family, Alicia Stardavant, said that she was woken up by a noise around 6:30 a.m. Her bedroom is literally across the fence from the girl's room. The girl said that she heard her dogs and the Celis family dogs barking. Besides them, she heard men's voices, seemingly on her side of the fence, not at the Celis family's home. But it was already getting light outside, and she didn't pay attention to it and fell asleep again. Alicia noted that the men did not lower their voices or whisper, and she didn't think for a second that there was also a small child there. The police set up a checkpoint around the Celis family's house and only allowed local residents through. The search initially focused on a small area around the house because in most cases, children are killed within a radius of 100 meters from the place of abduction. Then they expanded the search radius, included several apartment buildings, and interviewed residents. Officers checked the stadium where Isabelle's baseball game was supposed to take place, the local garbage dump. The lakes and ponds were inspected with underwater cameras and sonars. Forensic experts and search dogs searched the Celis family's home, and border guards distributed photos of Isabelle because when children go missing in Arizona, there is a high chance they end up on the other side of the border with Mexico. In addition, in 2012, 16 criminals who had committed violent acts against women and children lived near the family's home. All of them were interrogated and excluded at that time. A theory emerged that someone had noticed Isabelle playing with her brothers in the evening, followed the family, and abducted the girl from the house at night. Following this lead, officers checked the registration numbers of all the cars in the parking lot. Surveillance video cameras located near the family's home showed an unusually active nightlife. At 2:36 a.m., a private security company's car appeared in the alley near the house, and 2 more cars were shown in the parking lot 10 minutes later. Suddenly, a large number of pedestrians were wandering around the house, some of them interested in garbage cans, and an hour before the 911 call, a car quickly turned the corner near the trash can. But the girl did not appear anywhere in the 10 hours of filming. However, something interesting was discovered during the search of the house by the police. The officers found inscriptions on the door frame of Isabelle's wardrobe. The inscriptions were written in a child's handwriting and included such words as bad father, I don't love father, and bad day. Rebecca claimed she had no idea about this, but the police decided to interrogate Isabelle's family more thoroughly. One of the sons revealed that when their father drank, he became aggressive, cursed, and hit him twice. Therefore, investigators invited employees of the Child Protection Services concerned about the Celis sons, especially since, as it turned out, Child Protection Services had been called to the family's home more than once. In January 2012, one of the boys was washing dishes and left a glass in the detergent. Sergio drank water from that glass and scolded his son for his mistake. Rebecca insists that they laughed about the incident. But the next day, the boy told his friends about it, and someone's parents contacted the Child Protection Services. Anyway, in May 2012, at their request, Sergio voluntarily left the house, although Rebecca claimed that her husband was an excellent father and when Isabelle returned home, all questions would be answered. Although the incident was soon resolved, and Sergio was able to return home to his wife and sons, the family was upset that the investigation did not bring any results. Although the incident was soon resolved and Sergio was able to return home to his wife and children, the family was upset that the police continued to focus on them, especially Sergio, despite never being named a suspect. Later, the man stated, "It feels like the investigation never went beyond this house. That's what's so upsetting." So they hired private detective Jerry Snyder to conduct an unbiased investigation into Isabelle's abduction. And his suspicions fell on Rebecca's cousin, Justin Mastromarino. At first, Justin acted as a representative of the family, constantly speaking to journalists and giving interviews. But within 2 weeks of Isabelle's disappearance, he sent his car to Florida, hired the best lawyer, and left, refusing to answer reporters or police's questions. Such behavior seemed strange to the private detective. Moreover, Justin had lived in the Celis family's home for a long time and still had a key to the house. There was a version that Justin, who had previously stayed overnight in Isabelle's room, could owe money to someone and the criminal came for him. But instead of Justin, he found Isabelle in the room and took her for ransom or as leverage. On the other hand, his friend Sebastian Hartsfield is confident that Mastromarino did the right thing, and if he had the means, he would have left too. The thing is, Justin was tired of the intrusive attention of the media and the public. Sebastian said that they spent the evening of the abduction together with Justin. He reluctantly admits that it was April 20th, National Cannabis Day, so he and Justin smoked and drank all evening. Although there was a 6-hour gap when they were asleep, and he cannot say for sure where Justin was, Sebastian is confident in his friend's innocence. When the police finally questioned Justin, the police chief said that the investigator hired by the family had no evidence, but the police were absolutely sure of Justin's innocence. It is worth noting that Sergio was also suspected of owing money to bad people, and his daughter was kidnapped for ransom. Isabelle was at the age when children are more often abducted by relatives. She was kidnapped from the house where only her relatives were present, and Sergio was the last person to see her, kissing her goodnight at 11 o'clock. He did not pass a polygraph test. Moreover, the fact that the dogs barked at night indirectly confirms the involvement of someone from the family. How could a stranger know where the girl's room was, that she wouldn't be sleeping in her brother's bedroom, and that there would be no dogs in her room? Usually, at least one of them slept in her bedroom. How could the kidnapper know exactly how to avoid the surveillance cameras located on the street? Yet, besides suspicion, there was nothing linking Sergio or Justin to the crime. Where was Isabelle? Let's go back to the morning of July 23, 2012, when the rescue service received 3 distress calls. A child, a girl, called and said she wanted to report a kidnapping. She mentioned Isabelle's name and said he's coming, identified the district where she was located, and then the call disconnected. The officers went to the specified district, but they didn't find anyone. They traced the call to an apartment building where 2 sisters, aged 9 and 11, lived. The sisters had simply decided to play a prank. The calls caused a lot of fuss, but they were quickly released. However, their joke cost the city $4,700 in officers' wages spent on the search in the district specified by the girls. After this incident, the police tried several times to draw attention to the case, for example, by sharing an image of what Isabelle might look like several years later. But despite all efforts, there was no progress in the case for years. Who kidnapped Isabelle? Was it someone unknown to the family who entered through a window and took her? Did Justin consider kidnapping Isabelle because he was in debt and wanted to demand a ransom, but the kidnapping went wrong? Was one of her brothers involved in what happened to her, and are their relatives covering it up? Or does Isabelle's biological father know more than he's saying? Unexpectedly, On February 8, 2017, there was a breakthrough in the case. A woman named Melissa contacted the FBI and stated that they should speak to her fiancé, Christopher Clements, about the disappearance of Isabelle. Supposedly, he might know something about the girl's disappearance, but Melissa couldn't say anything more and they should talk to him. Finding Christopher proved to be quite easy. He was in jail on charges of robbery. Christopher confirmed to the agents that he knew where to find Isabelle, but demanded a deal. In exchange for information about Isabelle's whereabouts, he wants his charges dropped, his confiscated Acura Honda returned, and full immunity in Isabelle's case. He assured them that he only knows what happened to the girl. It is also known to a member of the Celis family. He hinted that Sergio knew about the kidnapping of his daughter and was involved in it. Christopher told them that Sergio was seen handing over Mexican gold coins to someone at a local pawn shop. Supposedly, there was a fight and Isabelle was taken to get the money that her father owed for the stolen coins. Christopher spoke very broadly, and no matter how much the agents questioned him, he didn't go into details. The man stood his ground, information in exchange for a deal. He got what he wanted. The prosecutor's office went for a deal, dropped the charges of robbery and returned the car. The man revealed where to find Isabelle, and on March 3, 2017, the police and the FBI found her remains. Rebecca and Sergio Celis faced the grim confirmation that Isabelle had left forever. Whatever dreams they had of a happy reunion were destroyed. However, the deal did not give Christopher Clements the desired freedom. Instead, he was transferred to the Maricopa County Jail, where he was charged with another robbery. The agreement did not provide full immunity, which Christopher insisted on in Isabelle's case. Investigators began digging deeper into the man's past. He started his criminal career at the age of 16 by committing first-degree violence. Since then, he had repeatedly gotten into trouble. The man's ex-wife said that Christopher was obsessed with adult movies, often brought girls from strip clubs home, and she was forced to sleep in the car until they left. And at the time of Isabelle's disappearance, he worked at a shopping center only 2 kilometers away from her home. Undoubtedly, detectives checked Sergio's connection to the nearby pawn shop mentioned by Christopher. They found out that 21 gold coins were stolen from the woman's house 2 months before Isabelle's abduction, and they believed that Christopher committed the theft. The surveillance camera captured him entering the pawn shop hours after the theft, delivering the goods, and receiving the money. The video did not suggest Sergio's involvement or any connection to the case. Most likely, Christopher was just studying the accusations against Sergio, which were mentioned in the press, and was talking to agents, trying to cast a shadow on the girl's father. The police received several search warrants, including one for the house where Christopher and his fiancée Melissa used to live. In one corner of the yard, investigators found a sheet of plywood under which was a plastic container containing ashes and several gruesome discoveries, including a faded lilac child's hoodie with a hood and a school assignment of a very young child with the name Mercedes on it. Her full name was Isabelle Mercedes Celis. They also found indecent photos of girls aged 3 to 13 on Christopher's devices. Searches on his computer included Isabelle Celis, unsolved cases in Arizona, and child killer acquitted. A former acquaintance of Christopher's said he talked about the Isabelle case and let slip that there might be evidence in the trunk of his car, so it was crucial to bring it back. The car was described as a Honda Acura that was returned to the man in exchange for information about Isabelle's whereabouts. It is still unknown how Isabelle died, but according to the same acquaintance, she was suffocated and her body was doused with chemicals. The man remembered that Christopher showed him photos of the Celis house that he had hidden in a Bible in his room. Investigators obtained a warrant for this Bible and indeed found pictures of the house. 2 months later, the Tucson police chief announced that they had a suspect, 36-year-old Christopher Clements, who had been charged with not 1, but 2 murders. The thing is, on March 3, 2017, When Christopher described to agents the location where they would find Isabelle, he mentioned an important marker, a pile of tires that clearly did not appear there in just one day. This instruction immediately alarmed the agents, because a few years ago, the police found the body of a teenage girl from Tucson near that same tire pile. The girl's name was Maribel Gonzalez. In June 2014, 2 years had passed since Isabelle's disappearance, when a rescue service dispatcher answered a horrifying call. A woman reported a body she had noticed by the roadside. The police who arrived on the call found signs that someone had been dragged on the ground, the smell of decay, and a naked body buried under the pile of tires. It was a location significantly distant from the nearest houses. The police shared with the media a photo of a chain with an anchor that the girl was wearing, as well as a tattoo on her collarbone, in hopes that the public would help identify her. Indeed, several people called the police saying that it was 13-year-old Maribel Gonzalez. Maribel's family said that she was seeing a 20-year-old man named Mariano. They had been together for 3 years but broke up a month before Maribel disappeared. Mariano told the police that she sent him a message around 11 to 12 p.m. on the day of her disappearance, asking him to pick her up because she had a fight with her mother. He ignored her message because he had to get up early for work. He never saw her again. Her boyfriend said that she loved to walk alone, even at night. She also liked to go to the mall, the same one near Isabelle's house where Christopher Clements worked. The police linked these cases based on the fact that the bodies were found in close proximity to each other. Christopher's DNA was compared to the DNA found on Maribel, and it matched. Isabelle was kidnapped and killed 2 years before Maribel. Could the perpetrator have been caught after the first crime and prevented Maribel's death? It turns out that Christopher's name came up during the investigation before his conversation with the agents in 2018, more than once. As it is already known, the officers contacted all individuals who committed sexual crimes and lived nearby Isabelle, violent acts against women and children. The list contained 16 names, including Christopher. He was listed as a Class 3 offender, meaning with a very high likelihood of reoffending. The police talked to him, but obviously, he was able to convince the officer that he had nothing to do with the case. Perhaps his girlfriend provided him with an alibi. Furthermore, after Isabelle's disappearance, her parents asked to recall any unexpected meetings, uninvited guests, traders, advertising agents, distributors, anyone who could arouse suspicion. Rebecca immediately remembered the man who was interested in their red Acura. He came twice, but the woman did not know his name, and he never entered the house. Interestingly, Christopher also mentioned that meeting during the interrogations. This is what he told FBI agents on February 10, 2017. According to him, 2 people pretended to be interested in the car. In fact, they needed to make sure that Sergio lived at that address. They approached Rebecca, and she gave them the phone number and said that they needed to talk about the possibility of buying from her husband Sergio. Thus, the men confirmed what they wanted. Christopher said that he just knew about this visit, but he himself never approached the Celis's house. However, during the conversation, he several times referred to we instead of they, as if confessing that one of the men was him. Christopher's description of the visit coincides with Rebecca's story, except for one detail. The woman described only one man who matched Christopher's description and drove the same car as he did. But her description differs slightly from the description given by her husband. What if the police had followed this lead immediately after Isabelle's disappearance? Would it have led them to Christopher Clements? Investigators believe that the kidnapping of Isabelle was not spontaneous. Christopher had planned his crimes. He repeatedly called the home of the woman from whom he stole gold coins when she was not home. He also called the Celis family home as early as October 2011. The day after the kidnapping, Christopher changed his phone number and washed his car. If cleaning his car usually cost him around $10, $35, this time he paid $110. However, Changing his phone number did not help, as phone records linked Christopher to 2 crimes. Footprints found at the scene of Isabelle's kidnapping matched sneakers that no one in the Celis family wore, but which Christopher was often seen wearing and even photographed in. Detectives also studied photos on his devices and found a miniature snapshot. It was a selfie of a man on the front seat of a car who looked like Clements, and a little girl lying on the back seat who was extremely similar to Isabelle. The photo was shown to Sergio and Rebecca. The woman agreed that the girl resembled Isabelle, but she could not say for sure because the image quality was terrible. Christopher claimed the child in the photo was his son. But when the photo was shown to Melissa, his fiancée, she began to shake. She did not recognize the child as her own. The child in the photo did not resemble the 1.5-year-old fair-haired boy. Instead, it was more like a dark-haired girl with her hair braided, which Isabelle's mother had done just before the kidnapping. The defense argued that the footprints were initially described as work boots. Christopher did not have his phone with him during those calls, and the blood in Isabelle's bedroom probably appeared before the kidnapping. Christopher's lawyers successfully pushed for 2 separate trials, one for the Isabelle case and one for the Maribel case, so that the prosecutor could not present evidence for both crimes at once. However, this did not help him much because he had already been found guilty of Maribel Gonzalez's murder. He still has to face trial for the kidnapping of Isabelle.